Harold Finch gripped Eliza's wrist so hard the bones ground together, his face inches from hers, whiskey breath hot against her cheek. "You think you can just leave?" he hissed, yanking her back across the boarding house floor while the landlady stood frozen in the doorway, too frightened to speak. His other hand found her throat, not squeezing, just resting there like a promise. "You belong to me, girl. You always have." Eliza didn't scream. She'd learned long ago that screaming only made it worse. She simply stared at the wall behind his head and waited, the way she'd waited through every storm of her 20 years, until the thunder passed and the silence returned, cold and familiar as winter. If you've ever watched someone choose survival over everything else, over pride, over safety, over the small, dignified life they deserved, then you already know Eliza's story in your bones. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next in Blackwood Ranch will shake you. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the like. It costs you nothing and means everything to a small channel trying to carry these stories further than we ever imagined. And drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to Wyoming, 1886, and meet the man who said 4 words that changed everything. The train had been 2 hours late out of Cheyenne, and by the time it groaned to a stop at Millhaven Depot, the afternoon sun was already cutting sideways across the platform, throwing long shadows over the warped wooden boards, and the half-dozen men standing there with their hats pulled low against the wind. Eliza Mercer sat in the last car with her suitcase wedged between her knees and her hands folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white somewhere back around the second hour. She hadn't loosened them since. Outside, the Wyoming Territory rolled past in every direction, pale grass, pale sky, the kind of emptiness that should have felt like freedom, but mostly just felt like nowhere to hide. She was 20 years old. She had 43 cents, one dress that still fit properly, a letter of introduction she'd memorized but never entirely believed, and 4 bruises in various stages of yellow-green healing across her left forearm where Harold Finch had grabbed her the last time she'd tried to leave a room without his permission. She was also, as of 3 weeks ago, technically engaged to a man named Gideon Blackwood, whom she had never met, never spoken to, and knew only through 2 letters written in a hand so economical with words it might have been carved rather than written. The first letter had said, "I am a rancher, 34 years old. The work is hard and the winters are harder. I am not looking for beauty or sweetness. I am looking for someone who is not afraid of either." The second letter had said, "Come if you want a fair life. Don't come if you expect an easy one." She'd read both letters sitting on the edge of her cot in Harold's house in Baltimore while the sound of his boots crossed the floor above her head, slow and deliberate, the way they always were when he'd been drinking and looking for something to be angry about. She'd read them twice. Then she'd folded them into her coat lining and started planning. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now the train hissed and settled, and Eliza stood up before she could talk herself out of it. The platform was cold for September. She hadn't expected that. She stepped down from the car with her suitcase in both hands and stood very still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the open light, looking for a man who might be Gideon Blackwood. What she found first was noise. 3 men she didn't know were arguing near the far end of the platform. Not the casual disagreement of men settling a bill, but something sharper, with edges. One of them, big across the shoulders with a jaw like a fence post and a coat that probably cost more than her train ticket, was doing most of the talking. The other 2 looked like hired hands, the kind who got paid not to ask questions. "I don't care what Blackwood told you," the big man said. He wasn't shouting, but his voice carried the way voices do when the person using them has never had to worry about being heard. "The water rights go through me or they don't go through at all. You can tell him I said so." The man he was talking at, a weathered older fellow with a deputy's badge and the posture of someone who'd already made up his mind not to die on this particular hill, just nodded twice and looked at his boots. Eliza told herself it wasn't her business. She looked away. That was when she saw him. I was standing apart from the arguing men, leaning against one of the depot's support posts with his arms crossed and his hat tilted just enough to shade his eyes. He wasn't watching the argument. He was watching her. Her Gideon Blackwood was taller than she'd imagined, though she'd tried not to imagine much. His face was the kind the frontier makes. Not handsome exactly, but formed, the way a piece of wood gets formed when someone who knows what they're doing works at it long enough. There was a scar along his jaw, old enough to be silver white. His coat was clean but worn at the elbows, and his boots were the kind that had actually been used. He pushed off the post and walked toward her. Not fast, not slow. The kind of walk that doesn't announce anything. She made herself stand still. She was very good at standing still. He stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her the way men rarely looked at her. Not at her face, not at her dress, but at her in some more comprehensive way, like he was taking inventory of something that mattered. Then his gaze dropped, just briefly, to the edge of her collar where the last of the bruising on her neck was still faintly visible despite the powder she'd pressed over it that morning on the train. His expression didn't change. That was what scared her somehow. That it didn't change the way a man's face changes when he's surprised or disgusted or calculating. It just went very, very still. He bent down and picked up her suitcase. His hand was close enough to hers that she had to stop herself from flinching away from it. "Those," he said quietly, "are the last bruises you'll ever wear." Not a question, not a promise wrapped in sweetness. Just a statement, flat and certain, the way a man states a fact about the weather or the price of grain. Eliza opened her mouth, closed it. She had prepared approximately 14 different responses for the first thing Gideon Blackwood might say to her. This was not one of them. "You don't know that," she said, because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving a factual error unchallenged, even when her hands were shaking. He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in the corner of his mouth that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. "No," he said, "I don't." He picked up her suitcase and turned toward the wagon. "But I mean to." "What?" The ride from Millhaven to Blackwood Ranch took 40 minutes on a good road, and this was not a good road. Eliza sat on the wagon bench with Gideon and tried to take inventory of what she'd gotten herself into, which was difficult because every time the wagon lurched over a rut, she had to use both hands to keep her seat, and also because Gideon Blackwood turned out to be the kind of person who did not fill silence out of obligation. She had lived her whole life with a man who filled every silence with something that needed to be survived. The quiet was disorienting. "How many hands do you run?" she asked, because she needed to say something and the ranch seemed like safe territory. 7 full-time, 2 seasonal. "Cattle?" "Mostly. Some horses." "How many head?" He glanced at her sidelong. 412 as of last Tuesday. "That's a lot for 7 hands." "It is." "So you're understaffed." A pause. "Yes." "I can help with the books," she said, "and I know how to do a feed inventory. I'm not saying that to make myself sound useful. I'm saying it because you should know what you're getting." Gideon was quiet long enough that she started to wonder if she'd said something wrong. Then he said, "Harold Finch teach you that?" She went rigid. "The man in Baltimore," he said. "The one who wrote to the agency. He listed himself as your guardian." "He was my mother's cousin," she said. The words came out very flat. "She died when I was 8. He took me in. And taught you bookkeeping. He had a shipping business. He needed someone who could count without stealing." She paused. "I was convenient." Gideon didn't say anything. The wagon rolled on. A hawk turned lazy circles against the pale sky somewhere to the north. "He doesn't know where you are," Gideon said. It wasn't quite a question. "He knows I came west. He doesn't know where exactly." She kept her eyes on the road. "The agency told me the arrangements were confidential." "They are." "Good." Another silence. Then, without looking at her, "You should know something about how this works. All right? I wrote to the agency because I needed someone who could manage a household and help run the business side of things. The ranch is growing faster than I can handle alone, and my foreman is good with cattle but can't add past 10 without his fingers." He shifted the reins in his hands. "I'm not in the habit of making promises I can't keep, so I'm going to tell you plainly what I can offer and what I can't." Eliza folded her hands in her lap. "Go ahead." "I can offer you a room of your own, a wage, same as any skilled hand. Safety, as far as I'm able to guarantee it, which is considerable but not absolute. Respect, a say in how the ranch runs within reason." He paused. "What I can't offer is easy company. I'm not a warm man by most people's reckoning. I work long hours and I'm poor at explaining myself when I'm tired, which is most of the time. She waited to make sure he was done. Is that all? The marriage arrangement stands if you want it, but it doesn't have to happen before you decide if this is a place you want to be. I'm not going to hold a contract over your head. She looked at him then, really looked at him, because something in the way he said it told her it had cost him something to say. He kept his eyes on the road. You've done this before, she said slowly, given someone a way out. Once. What happened? She took it. He said it without bitterness, just the plain recounting of a fact. Good woman, wrong situation. Eliza turned back to the road. The Wyoming territory spread out around them in every direction, enormous and indifferent, and not particularly interested in their arrangement. I appreciate the honesty, she said at last. I generally find it saves time. I'll stay, she said. At least long enough to see what the books look like. He nodded. That was all. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, and Eliza's first thought was that it was bigger than she'd expected, and her second thought was that someone had been working on it recently. There was fresh lumber on one side of the main barn, pale yellow against the older gray wood, and the fence posts along the drive were new. The house was 2 stories, plank-sided, with a porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Nothing fancy. But the windows were clean, and there were curtains in them, which surprised her. She'd expected a bachelor's house to be bare-boned, and the yard was not the chaos of a place that had given up on itself. 3 men were working near the barn when the wagon pulled in. They looked up. The closest one, young, maybe 19, with hay in his hair and a grin that suggested he smiled at almost everything, trotted over. She make it okay? She's right here, Gideon said, which was not an answer to the question but functioned as one. Ma'am. The young one yanked his hat off. I'm Cody. I do just about everything around here that Gideon doesn't want to do himself, which is considerable. He grinned at her. Welcome to Blackwood Ranch. Don't let the mud fool you. It's only half as bad as it looks. Cody, Gideon said, climbing down from the wagon. Sir? Her bag. Cody took the suitcase from Gideon with the particular eagerness of someone who was always slightly worried about getting things wrong. Eliza climbed down from the wagon herself. She had managed not to need help getting onto the train or off of it and saw no reason to start now, and landed on the hard-packed ground with both feet. The other 2 men near the barn hadn't come over. One was watching her with open curiosity. The other had already gone back to whatever he'd been doing. She filed that away. I'll show you the house, Gideon said. Her room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of the hall. It had a window that looked south toward a line of cottonwood trees, and beyond them, the faint silver glint of a creek. There was a bed with a real mattress, a washstand, a small chest of drawers, and a hook on the back of the door. There was also a lock on the door, with a key sitting in it. She noticed that immediately. Key's yours, Gideon said from the doorway. He hadn't come in. You lock it from the inside whenever you want. No one comes in without your say-so. That's a standing rule. She turned the key over in her hand. It was a small brass thing, worn smooth from use, which meant it had been used before, which meant someone else had locked this door before her. And the fact that Gideon had kept the rule intact when that person left told her something she didn't quite have words for yet. Thank you, she said. Supper's at 6. If you want to eat before then, the kitchen's yours. He started to leave. Gideon. He stopped, turned. The man at the depot, she said. The one arguing with the deputy. Who was he? Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite wariness. Something more than that. Silas Crow, he said. He runs the Crowned Sea, east of here. Big operation. Getting bigger. He mentioned water rights. He usually does. Is that going to be a problem? Gideon leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. It was the most at ease she'd seen him, and it still wasn't particularly at ease. It's an existing problem, he said. Not a new one. But it's getting worse. He looked at her for a moment. You're quick, he said. It didn't sound like a compliment exactly. More like an observation about a piece of equipment he wasn't sure yet how to use. I've spent 20 years reading rooms where I wasn't allowed to ask questions, she said. You get very good at reading them anyway. He nodded once. Get some rest, he said. Ranch starts early. She listened to his boots go down the hall. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, the real mattress, the first real mattress she'd had in years, and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a very long time. She just sat there and breathed, listening to the sounds of a working ranch coming through the window. Men calling to each other, horses moving in the paddock, the distant clang of something metal being repaired, and tried to figure out whether the feeling rising in her chest was hope or just the particularly dangerous cousin of it. She came down to supper at 6 and found 4 men already at the table. Gideon at the head, Cody beside him, and 2 others she hadn't met yet. An older woman with gray-streaked hair and the efficient movements of someone who had been feeding large groups of people for many years was setting a pot of stew on the table. "Mabel," Gideon said, "this is Eliza Mercer." Mabel looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who had no time for pretense. "You eat? Pardon?" "Some women come out here and don't eat. I've seen it." She set down the bread. "It's a working ranch. If you don't eat, you fall over." "I don't need anyone falling over." "I eat," Eliza said. "Good." Mabel pointed at the empty chair. "Sit." She sat. Across from her, one of the men she hadn't been introduced to was staring at her collar. She held his gaze until he looked away. "Roy," Gideon said quietly, without looking up from the bread he was cutting. The man, Roy, apparently, mid-40s, with the cracked, sun-dark hands of a man who'd spent decades outdoors, straightened up and stared at his bowl instead. Cody, either oblivious to the tension or determined to override it, said, "You ride Miss Mercer?" "Some. Well enough to manage a half-broke gelding, or just enough not to fall off a plow horse." "Somewhere in between," she said honestly. "I can probably get better." Cody brightened. "I can teach you. I'm a real good teacher. Gideon, tell her I'm a good teacher." "You're adequate," Gideon said. "He means excellent. He just can't say it." Despite herself, Eliza almost smiled. The other man she hadn't met, thin, 50-ish, with the worried expression of someone who had made a career of anticipating disasters, cleared his throat. "Hector Vargas," he said, "foreman." "Miss Mercer," she said, "we're glad to have some help with the numbers. The payroll's been giving me headaches for 2 months. I'll look at it tomorrow." Hector looked faintly relieved. "Appreciate it." The supper went on. The food was plain, and there was enough of it. Nobody asked her where she'd come from or why she'd bruised. Nobody pretended not to notice. They just didn't make it a thing, and she found she didn't know how to feel about that. Except grateful in the hollow, cautious way she'd learned to feel grateful for things that might still be taken away. Afterward, when the others had gone, she helped Mabel clear the table without being asked. Mabel didn't say thank you. She just made room at the wash basin and handed her a towel. "You'll do," Mabel said eventually, which from her, Eliza was already learning, was fairly close to high praise. She was in the ranch office the next morning by 7, which was apparently late by Blackwood standards. She'd heard movement in the house since before 5. But the office was empty and she took that as permission. The books were worse than she'd expected. Not dishonest. There was nothing in them that looked like theft or deliberate confusion. Just disorganized in the particular way of a man who is very good at keeping things in his head and very poor at getting them onto paper. There were 6 months of payroll recorded in 3 different ledgers, 2 different systems of counting cattle that didn't reconcile with each other, and a set of accounts payable that appeared to have been updated at random intervals by someone using a different pen each time. She sat down, found a clean sheet of paper, and started at the beginning. She was still at it 2 hours later when Gideon came in. He stopped in the doorway. She had spread papers across the entire surface of the desk in a system that probably looked, to him, like chaos. "Don't touch anything," she said without looking up. "I know where everything is." A pause. "All right. Your feed accounts and your lumber accounts are mixed together in the April ledger. Did you hire someone to build that new section of the barn in April?" "March and April, yes." "Is the lumber supplier Henderson Brothers?" "Yes." She made a note. "Okay, you've been paying them twice for the same delivery. It looks like it happened 3 times. You're owed—" She did the arithmetic quickly in her head. $47. Silence. "From Henderson Brothers," she added, in case he'd missed it. "I heard you," he said. He came into the room and stood beside the desk, looking at the papers with an expression that was difficult to read. $47. "I'll write them a letter if you want. Polite, but specific." "Do that." She wrote it that afternoon. He signed it without changing a word. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized 3 months of accounts, and identified 2 other billionaires and one case where a hand named Pete had apparently been drawing a wage for a month he hadn't worked, which Gideon addressed with Pete in a short conversation she didn't witness, but which resulted in Pete looking considerably less comfortable at supper for 3 nights afterward. The ranch hands were cautious around her at first, which she understood. She'd arrived from nowhere with a bruised neck and a connection to the boss that nobody quite knew how to categorize. She was neither wife nor hired hand nor guest, and the frontier was not a place that was comfortable with in-between things. But she was careful. She asked questions about the work before she offered opinions about it. She pulled her own weight in the house without making it theatrical. She didn't complain about the cold or the mud or the fact that the outhouse was 50 feet from the house in the dark. Cody, who had apparently decided on the second day that she was acceptable, started briefing her on the ranch politics as they occurred to him, in no particular order, while doing various tasks that kept his hands busy. "Roy's not a bad man," he said one morning, cleaning a bridle near the barn. "He just doesn't trust new things fast. Give him a month." "I'm not asking him to trust me," Eliza said. "I'm asking him to pass the bread when I ask for it." Cody grinned. "That's fair. He'll get there." "Who's the man on the gray horse I keep seeing on the north fence line?" Cody stopped grinning. "What?" she said. "That's one of Crow's men." He went back to the bridle, but his hands weren't as easy as they'd been. They'd been running the fence line 2-3 times a week for the past month, just watching, not doing anything. He glanced at her. "Yet." "What does Gideon say about it?" "Not much, which usually means he's thinking about it a lot." She found Gideon in the barn that evening, working on a piece of saddle leather with the focused, unhurried quality of a man who used physical work to organize his thoughts. The barn was quieter than the house, lit amber with late afternoon light. She sat down on a tack box nearby. He didn't stop what he was doing. "Crow's men are watching the north fence," she said. "I know." "How long has he been making trouble?" Gideon kept working. "Crow moved into the territory 4 years ago, bought up 3 failing operations east of here and combined them. Smart enough businessman, not patient enough to grow the way the land requires." He pulled a stitch through. "He needs the creek that runs through my north pasture. Legally, the water rights are mine. He's been contesting that in the county office for 2 years. And so far the county clerk has upheld my claim. But Crow has money, and money makes paperwork move in different directions. Has he done anything physical yet, beyond watching the fence?" He set the leather down and looked at her. "Why?" "Because there's a difference between a man who's trying to win legally and a man who's getting ready to stop trying legally." The look he gave her was not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. "Somebody cut 3 fence posts on the south line 2 weeks ago. I haven't been able to prove it was Crow's men." "But you think it was?" "I think it was meant to tell me something. That he's losing patience." "That he's losing patience," Gideon agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "The water rights documentation. Is it in the county office?" "Copies there, originals here." "Where here?" He nodded toward the back of the barn, where a wooden cabinet with a heavy lock sat against the far wall. "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're thinking about this like a problem to be managed, aren't you?" "I'm thinking about it like a fight that's coming." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. He picked up the leather again. She sat on the tack box and listened to the horses moving in their stalls, and neither of them said anything for a while. And she noticed that the silence between them didn't feel like emptiness anymore. It felt like the beginning of something. The letter arrived on a Thursday, in the mail pouch that came out from Millhaven once a week. Gideon handed it to her across the supper table without comment, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly, which told her he'd already read the name on the outside. She turned it over. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar in the particular way that a scar is familiar. Not warmly, but permanently. Miss Eliza Mercer, care of Millhaven Depot, Wyoming Territory. She kept her face still. She folded the envelope once and put it in her apron pocket. "Eliza," Gideon said. "Just her name." "I know." "You don't have to—" "I know," she said again. She didn't open it until she was upstairs with the door locked behind her. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and read it. It was 3 paragraphs. The first said she had broken a legal contract by leaving without his consent. The second said she owed him compensation for lost work and household services rendered. The third said he would be coming to collect what was his. She folded it back up, put it in the drawer, sat there with her hands in her lap. He's coming. She'd known it was possible. She'd told herself she'd prepared for it. But sitting in this room with the real mattress and the key in the lock and the window looking south toward the cottonwoods, and knowing he intended to reach into it and pull her back the way you pull a dog by its collar, her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on her thighs and made herself breathe. She sat there a long time. Then she got up, unlocked the door, and went downstairs. Gideon was still at the table, nursing the last of his coffee. Everyone else had cleared out. He looked up when she came in and waited. She put the letter on the table in front of him. He read it. His face did the thing where it went very still. Then he set it down flat on the table and looked at it for a moment. "When?" he asked. "He doesn't say. Somewhere between a week and a month, I'd guess." Gideon was quiet. The lantern on the table threw his shadow up long and angular against the kitchen wall. "He can't take you," he said finally. "You're not a minor. You don't owe him the legal standing he's claiming." "He doesn't care about legal standing," she said. "He cares about winning." Gideon looked at her. "So do I." She hadn't cried in years. Her eyes burned now briefly, and she looked at the lamp until the feeling passed. "I'm not going back," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "No," Gideon said. "You're not." He folded the letter and put it in his own shirt pocket. She watched him do it without asking why, because she thought she already understood. He was making it his problem too, which was not something anyone had done for her before, and she didn't quite know how to hold that. She went back upstairs. She locked the door. She lay down on the real mattress in the dark. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains and moved through the cottonwoods along the creek in a long, sighing rush, and the ranch was quiet around her, and Eliza Mercer, 20 years old, 43 cents, 4 healing bruises, closed her eyes and did not sleep for a very long time. But she did not pack her bag. That, for now, was enough. The letter sat in Gideon's shirt pocket for 3 days before either of them mentioned it again. That was how Eliza knew he was taking it seriously. Not because he talked about it, but because he didn't. A man who dismissed a threat made noise about dismissing it. A man who was genuinely working through a problem went quiet in a particular way. The way a river goes quiet right before it narrows and picks up speed. She watched him without being obvious about it, which was a skill she'd been refining since childhood. He started varying the time he rode the fence lines. He had a conversation with Hector that lasted 20 minutes and took place out of earshot of the bunkhouse. He wrote 2 letters. She knew because she saw him seal them, though she didn't ask who they were to, and sent Cody into Mill Haven with them on Wednesday morning before the regular mail pouch came through. He didn't tell her any of this. He also didn't tell her not to notice. She took that as its own kind of conversation. Meanwhile, there was work. There was always work, and she had come to understand that this was one of the things the ranch gave her that Harold Finch never had, the particular dignity of being busy with something that mattered. The feed inventory needed to be done before the first hard frost. The payroll for October had to be reconciled. There was a dispute with a supplier in Cheyenne over the price of a lumber delivery that Hector couldn't resolve because the supplier kept sending letters addressed to Mr. Blackwood, and Gideon kept losing them under other papers. "Just let me handle Henderson," she told Gideon on Thursday morning. "All of it." He was pulling on his coat by the door. "You sure?" "I've been handling his billing errors for 2 weeks already. At this point, I know his invoices better than he does." A pause. "Don't be rude to him." "I won't be rude, I'll be precise." She looked up from the ledger. "There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression. "All right," he said, and went out. She wrote the letter to Henderson that afternoon. It was 4 paragraphs, every sentence numbered in its logic, every error documented with the invoice date and the paid receipt reference. She was not rude. She was, as she'd promised, precise. She signed it E. Mercer, Ranch Accounts, Blackwood Ranch, and gave it to Cody for the next mail pouch. Henderson sent a bank draft for the full amount within 10 days. Hector presented her with the check at supper with the particular reverence of a man witnessing something he didn't entirely understand but was deeply grateful for. $47, he said. "I've been arguing with that man for 6 months." "You were arguing with him," she said. "I just showed him his own paperwork." Roy, sitting at the far end of the table, snorted. It might have been a laugh. It was the first sound he'd made in her direction that wasn't silence or barely contained suspicion, and she noted it the way she noted all small shifts in territory, carefully, without making a show of it. It was Cody who told her about the well. He came into the ranch office on a Friday afternoon looking like he'd run most of the way from the south pasture, which he probably had. His hat was missing, which meant he'd lost it somewhere at speed. "South well's fouled," he said. "The water's coming up brown and it smells wrong. Not mud wrong, chemical wrong." Eliza put down her pen. "How long?" "Don't know. Pete checked it 2 days ago and it was fine. Tom checked this morning and it wasn't." "Where's Gideon?" "North fence. I sent Danny to get him." She stood up. "Is it just the one well?" "Far as we know, but the south well serves the lower pasture and part of the barn system." He was twisting his hat brim. He'd found it somewhere en route, apparently. "Those cattle can't drink that water, Miss Mercer." "How many head are using that pasture?" "About 80. She was already moving toward the door. "Get them shifted to the upper pasture water before nightfall. All 80. And nobody pulls from that well again until we know what's in it. Gideon's going to want the cattle not to drink poison," she said. "Move them." Cody moved them. Gideon arrived back from the north fence 40 minutes later, rode straight to the south well, crouched down and smelled it himself, and said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up and looked at the ground around the wellhead with the focused patience of a man reading a language written in dirt. There were boot prints, recent, more than one set. "Crow's men were on the south fence line day before yesterday," Hector said, coming up behind him. "We clocked them at the property line, but they didn't cross." "They crossed," Gideon said. His voice was very even. "They just did it at night." Eliza stood back and watched him work through it. She could see the anger in him. It was in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands, which were the kinds of hands that were dangerous when they moved and dangerous in a different way when they didn't. But he wasn't letting it run ahead of his thinking. "Can you prove it was them?" she asked. "Not yet." "Then we need to be careful about what we say in town." She looked at the well. "And we need to have that water analyzed. Is there anyone in Millhaven who can do that?" "Doc Haverfield has a kit. He's not much of a doctor, but he knows chemicals." "Get him out here. Before anything else, get it documented." She turned to Gideon. "If this goes legal, and it might, you need evidence, not suspicion. Evidence." He looked at her with that look again, the one she'd started to recognize as the moment when he revised something about her upward in whatever internal accounting he kept. "You're thinking 3 steps ahead," he said. "I'm thinking about what Harold Finch would have done," she said, which was true. Harold had spent 20 years building paper justifications for everything he did to her, making sure every record showed his side. She had learned the system from the inside of it, and she intended to use that knowledge for something other than enduring it. Gideon sent for Doc Haverfield that afternoon. Doc Haverfield was a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers and the professionally dubious disposition of someone who had seen too many situations where the best outcome still wasn't good. He tested the well water with the seriousness of a man who understood that what he found would matter, and he wrote up his findings in a report that used words like concentrated lye compound and deliberate introduction, likely given concentration levels, and not consistent with natural contamination. He gave 2 copies of the report to Gideon. Gideon gave one to Eliza. "File this with the county office," she said. "Even if they don't act on it, you want a record that this happened and when." "Crow has friends at the county office." "I know. File it anyway." She looked at the report. "A record he can't make disappear is a record that exists whether he wants it to or not." Gideon filed it the next week. The county clerk accepted it with the bland, non-committal expression of a man who has been paid to be non-committal and is very good at his job. The copy she kept went into the locked cabinet in the barn, next to the water rights documentation. The first time Roy actually talked to her, really talked, not just grunted in her direction, was a Sunday afternoon near the end of October, when the first real cold had come down and most of the hands were doing indoor work. She was in the barn running a count on the winter hay supply, which was tedious and cold but necessary, and Roy came in to repair a section of shelving along the back wall and worked in silence for a while before he said, without looking at her, "You ride the north boundary yesterday?" "Yes." "By yourself?" "It was just a survey. I wasn't going far." "Crow's men have been ranging closer." She kept counting bales. I know. You shouldn't ride out alone. I appreciate the concern. She made a note on her tally sheet. I'll be more careful. A pause. The sound of Roy driving a nail, clean and precise. That's not what I meant. He set down the hammer. I mean, you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to be watching your back on a property that's supposed to be safe. She looked at him then. He was still not looking at her. His jaw was set in the hard, unhappy line of a man who wanted to say something and wasn't certain he had the right to say it. Roy, she said carefully. I was married, he said. My wife died 8 years ago. Fever. He picked the hammer back up but didn't use it. She was a smart woman, smarter than me about most things. I didn't always... He stopped, started again. I didn't always make it easy for her to be heard. Eliza waited. You're doing good work here, he said. For the ranch, for Gideon. He finally glanced at her. I wasn't trying to make it harder. At the start. I just didn't know what to make of you. And now? Now I think Crow ought to be worried. He went back to the shelving. That's all I'm saying. She turned back to her hay count. Thank you, Roy. He made a gruff sound that might have been acknowledgement. They worked in comfortable silence for another hour, and when he left, he touched the brim of his hat at her, which he had never done before. She filed that away too. The night the fence came down on the northwest line, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and the moon was thin and doing very little to help anyone see anything. Gideon was already up when it happened. She heard him moving in the hall at just past midnight, heard his boots go down the stairs fast, and was out of bed and pulling on her coat before she'd fully decided to do so. By the time she got downstairs, Hector was at the back door with a lantern and Cody behind him, and Roy was already pulling his horse out of the paddock. Stay inside, Gideon said when he saw her. What happened? Northwest fence. Tom heard it go. Sounds like they took down a whole section. He was pulling on his coat with the practiced speed of a man who'd been doing this a long time. I need you to stay here with Mabel and make sure no one comes near the house. She looked at him. He looked at her. I'm not going to argue about this one, he said, low. I need someone I trust at the house. That's you. All right? It was the most direct thing he'd said to her since the first day, and the word trust landed somewhere she hadn't expected it to. She nodded once. Lock the front, he said. Rifle's above the kitchen door. You know how to use it? I know how to use it. He held her gaze for another second. Then he went. She locked the front. She made Mabel sit down with a cup of coffee she didn't want. She took the rifle down from above the door. It was a Winchester, well-maintained, which surprised her for reasons she couldn't quite name, and set it on the table within reach and sat down with it and waited. They came back at 2 a.m. No injuries, which was the first thing she checked when they walked in the door. The fence section had been brought down cleanly. Cut post, not broken ones, which meant tools and planning and at least 4 men working in the dark. They'd found cattle tracks going through the gap, heading east toward Crow's property line. 23 head of cattle, gone. We'll get them back, Hector said, but he said it the way people say things they feel obligated to say rather than things they believe. Gideon sat down at the kitchen table. He looked tired in a way that went past physical tired, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. 23 head, he said to nobody in particular. Eliza set a cup of coffee in front of him. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. This is escalating, she said. The well, the fence post before, and now this. He's not waiting for legal decisions anymore. I know. So what's the next step? He looked up. I'm thinking. Think out loud. He almost said something that was probably, that's not how I work. But he looked at her and reconsidered. I can ride to the county sheriff in the morning, file a livestock theft claim. You should. But Crow probably has something ready for that. She sat down across from him. He's been building toward this. He's not improvising. What are you saying? I'm saying he's probably got a story. That your fence came down on its own and his men found the cattle wandering and were bringing them back, or they were in disputed territory. She kept her voice even. He's too careful to do something like this without a cover. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. How do you know how men like that think? I grew up in a house with one, she said. He absorbed that. His jaw worked briefly, and then he looked at his coffee. We need people on our side, she said. Not just legally, in the community. Neighbors who will say publicly what they're willing to say privately. She'd been thinking about this since the well. Who else has Crow been pressuring? The Sutton family, east of the creek. Old man Sutton filed a letter of complaint with the county 2 months ago and then withdrew it. I always figured Crow got to him somehow. He thought. The Hallorans are worried. Bill Halloran told me last month that Crow's men have been riding his south pasture. Have you talked to them directly? Not recently. Then we should. He looked at her across the table, and for just a moment the fatigue in his face eased slightly, the way a man's face eases when he realizes he doesn't have to carry all of something alone. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. I'll go see Bill Halloran tomorrow, he said. After the sheriff. I'll come with you. Eliza. You're going to tell him about the water rights and the stolen cattle, she said. I've got the documentation on the water rights in a format that's easy to read, and I can explain the legal exposure clearly. She raised her eyebrows. Unless you think you'll do better without me. He was quiet for a beat. You're not easy to say no to. I've been told. I'll bet. He stood up. Get some sleep. We leave early. She watched him go. Then she sat there in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup, and she tried to think carefully about Harold Finch, where he was, how long the train would take from Baltimore, whether he'd come himself or send someone first. She thought about what the letter had said, coming to collect what was his. She was not a thing to be collected. She had known that for years in theory. She was still learning what it meant to act on it. The Halloran place was smaller than Blackwood Ranch. A single-story house with a solid barn and a view of the mountains that probably compensated for a lot of the hardship involved in being out this far. Bill Halloran met them at the gate, a broad, slow-moving man in his 50s with careful eyes and the particular caution of someone who had been burned by being incautious. He shook Gideon's hand. He looked at Eliza with the assessing blankness of a man deciding whether her presence was a complication. This is Eliza Mercer, Gideon said. She manages our accounts and documentation. I brought her because she knows the water rights file better than I do. Bill nodded slowly. Come in, then. His wife, Ada, small, quick, with the practical intelligence of a woman who has spent decades making things work on what was available, made coffee, and then sat down at the table with them, which told Eliza something useful about how the Halloran household operated. She laid out the water rights documentation on the table, organized by date. She walked Bill through it the same way she'd walked through the Henderson billing. Methodical, clear, no histrionics. She showed him the chemical report on the well. She told him about the fence and the 23 head. Bill listened with his arms folded and his eyes on the papers. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. He sent 2 men to my south fence line 4 weeks ago, he said finally. They told me the creek water I've been drawing from for 20 years is disputed territory. Said Crow's surveyors had found the old boundaries were wrong. His jaw tightened. I don't believe them, but I don't have the papers to prove it the way you've got yours. Do you have your original homestead filing? Eliza asked. Somewhere. Find it, she said. We'll help you document it the same way we've documented ours. If Crow wants to fight water rights across the valley, he should have to fight all of them at once. Ada set down her coffee cup. What you're talking about is the neighbors standing together. Yes. Crow's got more money than all of us put together. He does, Eliza said. But he can't buy paper trails that don't exist, and he can't suppress records in 3 different county offices at the same time. She leaned forward slightly. He's counting on everyone being afraid separately. It works differently when people aren't. Bill looked at Gideon. She always like this? More or less, Gideon said. Lord? Bill unfolded his arms. All right. What do you need from us? They visited 2 more neighbors that week, the Suttons, who were frightened but willing once they understood they weren't alone, and a widow named Clara Marsh who ran a modest sheep operation on the western edge of the valley and had been watching Crow's expansion with the cold, unsurprised eyes of someone who'd seen this kind of thing before. Clara made them sit down for supper, which they did, and over the meal she said, You know he's going to come at you harder once he realizes you're organizing. I know, Gideon said. Are you ready for that? He looked at Eliza for just a fraction of a second before he looked back at Clara. It was a small thing. Clara noticed it. Clara was the kind of woman who noticed everything. We're working on it, Gideon said. Clara nodded. She looked at Eliza with something that wasn't quite approval but was moving in that direction. You're smarter than you look, she said. That's meant as a compliment. You look very young. I've been told that too, Eliza said. Clara almost smiled. Good. The valley needs someone with a clear head. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by the Millhaven Depot agent who rode out personally because he was, as he told Mabel at the door, a man of some conscience when it came to delivering bad news. Gideon found Eliza in the office and stood in the doorway with the telegram in his hand, and she knew from the way he was holding it that it was about Harold. He's in Cheyenne, Gideon said. Arrived on the evening train 4 days ago. He's been asking around about Millhaven. He paused. My contact says he's not alone. She set her pen down. Who's with him? At least 2 men, not family, the kind of men you hire. She had prepared for this. She had known it was coming. She was still cold, suddenly, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. How long to get here from Cheyenne? She asked. 2 days on horseback. Day and a half if he pushes. She looked at her hands on the desk, then she looked up. I'm not leaving. I didn't ask you to. I know. I'm telling you anyway. She was surprised by how steady her voice was. I left once because I had no choice and nothing to leave with. I'm not leaving again. Gideon came into the room properly and sat down across from her, the way he sat when they went through accounts together, like this was a problem that had facts associated with it, and facts could be worked through. If he comes here and makes a legal claim, he has no legal claim. I'm not a minor. I owe him nothing. His letter said contract breach. The arrangement the agency uses is not a legal indenture, and he knows it. He's using the language to frighten people. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. He does that. He finds the vocabulary that scares people the most and uses it without worrying about whether it's accurate. Gideon looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I need to know everything about him, not to frighten you by asking, because the more I know about how he operates, the better I can protect against it. She thought about it. Then she started talking. She told him about the shipping business, about the accounts she'd managed from the age of 12 onward, about the way Harold structured his debts, always with witnesses, always with paperwork that made the debtor look like the aggressor, about the 2 men who had tried to report him to the police and found themselves suddenly accused of theft, about the way he'd kept her, not locked up, nothing so obvious, just a web of obligation and dependency and strategic isolation so fine-threaded you didn't notice it until the day you tried to move and couldn't. Gideon listened to all of it without interrupting. His expression didn't give much away, but his hands, resting on the desk between them, tightened once and then deliberately relaxed, and she understood that the anger was there, the same cold fury she'd seen on the platform that first day, but that he was choosing very carefully what to do with it. When she finished, he said, He'll try to make you look unstable, grateful, dependent, and then ungrateful. He'll say he raised you, protected you, and you repaid him with abandonment. Yes. And you'll need to be able to say your piece in front of other people without it looking like you're the unreliable one. I know. Can you do that? She met his eyes. I've been doing it my whole life, she said. The difference is, I'm choosing who to say it to now. He nodded. Then he stood up and pulled on his coat. I'm going to send word to Clara Marsh and the Hallorans. I want them to know what's coming, and I want them to know why. He paused at the door. You should talk to Mabel. Why Mabel? Because she's been on this ranch 12 years, and she has the longest memory of anyone here, and because... He stopped, started again. Because she's going to be in your corner whatever happens, and it helps to know who your people are before the trouble arrives. He left. She sat there for a moment in the office she'd made her own over these weeks. The organized ledgers, the neat files, the Henderson correspondence filed under resolved, and she felt something that wasn't exactly fear and wasn't exactly readiness, but lived somewhere between the two. Harold was coming. Crow was already here. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Mabel, as it turned out, had her own things to say on the subject of Harold Finch, none of them printable, and all of them delivered over the bread she was making in the efficient, non-dramatic tone of a woman stating obvious facts. Men like that don't come alone because they think they'll need backup, she said, punching the dough. They come with backup because they want you to see the backup. It's theater. I know. So don't let it be theater on his terms. Eliza looked up from the table. What does that mean? It means he's expecting you to be afraid. Mabel turned the dough. He's probably expecting this ranch to look like an obstacle, something between him and you that he needs to get through or around. She looked at Eliza sideways. Don't let him think of it that way. What should he think of it as? A home, Mabel said, with people who are already decided about what they'll do if he shows up. She went back to the bread. He's going to walk into something very different from what he imagines. Make sure that's obvious from the moment he arrives, if he arrives. Eliza sat with that for a moment. Mabel. What? Has Gideon... She stopped, tried again. Has he always been like this? The way he is? Mabel was quiet for a moment. The bread dough got turned again. He's been alone a long time, she said finally. Lost his brother in '81. Before that, it was just the two of them running this place after their father died. She paused. He's not cold. People think he is because he doesn't waste words. But he's one of the only men I've known who does what he says and says what he means. And in this territory, that is rarer than it ought to be. Eliza didn't say anything. She looked at her hands on the table. He's been different since you came, Mabel added, in the same no-nonsense tone she used for everything. Not softer, but... She searched for the word. More present. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of bread being made and the wind moving around the corners of the house. And outside the window, the sky was going the particular orange-gray of a Wyoming evening in late fall, and Blackwood Ranch settled around them like something that intended to stay. Eliza looked at the window and thought about Harold Finch somewhere on the road from Cheyenne, riding toward a place he didn't understand at all, expecting to find the girl he'd broken. He was going to be wrong about that. She was counting on it. He arrived on a Thursday. Not Harold. Not yet. What arrived first was a rider from Clara Marsh, a boy of about 15 who came at a gallop and pulled up in the yard breathing hard, with a note tucked inside his coat that he handed to Gideon without a word. Gideon read it, folded it, put it in his pocket, and told the boy to go inside and get something to eat. Eliza was on the porch when this happened. She waited. Crow's called a meeting, Gideon said, coming up the steps. At the Millhaven Feed Hall, day after tomorrow. He's invited every rancher in the valley. He looked at the note in his hand. Clara says he's framing it as a community water management discussion. He's framing it as reasonable so people come, Eliza said. That's what Clara thinks too. Are you going? He looked at her. We're going. She nodded. Then, Harold will be here by then, or close to it. I know. So Crow is timing this. Gideon leaned against the porch rail. The sky to the west was the color of an old bruise, purple-gray and heavy with the promise of cold. They're connected somehow, he said. I've been thinking it since your letter came. Crow finds out about the mail order arrangement through town gossip, finds out you came from Baltimore, does some asking around and finds Finch. A man who claims a legal hold on you is useful to a man who wants leverage over me. Eliza went cold in a way she recognized. Not the sudden cold of shock, but the slow, seeping cold of a fear confirmed. Crow told him where I was. Or paid someone to. It would explain how Finch found Millhaven so fast. The agency's supposed to keep that confidential. He always had money when he needed it, she said. Harold. He knew how to find people who could be bought. She gripped the porch rail and looked out at the yard, where Cody was moving between the barn and the paddock doing evening chores, and Roy was carrying a water bucket with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who's been doing physical work for 40 years. Everything ordinary. Everything about to stop being ordinary. They're going to come at us from both sides at the same time. That's what it looks like. Then we need to make sure we're standing when it happens. She turned to him. What's your plan for the meeting? My plan is to go and hear what he says. That's not a plan. That's attendance. His mouth moved in that way she'd come to recognize. You have something better? I have something in addition. She crossed her arms against the cold. Crow is going to make an offer at that meeting. Something that sounds generous because he needs the room to think he's being reasonable. If he wanted to just take what he wanted, he'd have done it already. He hasn't, which means he still cares what the community thinks of him, which means the community is still a card we can play. Go on. So we need the neighbors we've talked to, Bill Halloran, the Suttons, Clara. We need them there. And we need them to be ready to say something. About the water rights. About everything. The well. The fence. The cattle. She looked at him. Not angry, not accusatory, just factual. What happened? When? With documentation if they have it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Crow's going to call it slander. He can call it whatever he wants. You can't slander a man with his own timeline. He looked at her steadily for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods down by the creek, that long sigh that she'd started to hear as something like music in the weeks she'd been here. Then he pushed off the rail. "I'll ride to Halloran's tomorrow morning," he said. "You write it up, all of it, everything we've documented. I want something I can put in front of people that they can read with their own eyes." She was already moving toward the door. "It'll be ready by morning." She worked until past midnight, and the result was 6 pages in her careful, angular hand, everything organized by date, cross-referenced, with the chemical analysis of the well attached as an addendum and the water rights documentation summarized clearly at the front. She'd written it the way she'd written the letter to Henderson. No excess language, nothing that couldn't be proved, every claim attached to its source. When she came down in the morning, Gideon was already at the kitchen table with his coffee. She put the 6 pages in front of him. He read them without speaking. He read them twice. "You did this last night," he said. "I wasn't sleeping anyway." He looked up. He didn't say thank you exactly. What he said was, "This is good work," in the same tone he used for things that mattered, and she found that she preferred it to gratitude. He rode to Halloran's. She spent the morning going over the ranch accounts one more time, looking for anything she'd missed, making sure the ledgers were complete and organized and locked. She wrote 3 letters, to the county land office, to a lawyer in Cheyenne whose name she'd found in a months-old newspaper, and to the territorial marshal's office, which she did not entirely expect to produce results, but which produced, at minimum, a record that the request had been made. Cody came into the office around noon and sat down in the chair across from her without being invited. "You're going to the meeting tomorrow," he said. "Yes." "Gideon's going to want you to stay back." "Gideon knows better than to tell me that." Cody grinned, briefly. Then the grin faded. "You know Crow's going to have people there, not just ranchers." "I expect so." "Roy heard in town that Finch and his men came through Millhaven yesterday evening, asking after the ranch." She set down her pen. "Where did Roy hear that?" "The livery man. Finch apparently asked specifically about the mail-order bride from Baltimore." Cody's voice was careful and even. "Use that phrase. Mail-order bride. Like it was the most important thing about you." She looked at her hands for a moment, then she picked up her pen again. "Thank you for telling me." "Eliza." He leaned forward. "I've been on a lot of ranches. I came to this one because Gideon he's a square shooter, and that's rarer than it should be. And in 3 weeks you fixed things here that nobody else could fix." He paused. "I just want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, the hands are with you. Roy put it to a vote this morning, which nobody asked him to do. It was unanimous." She kept her eyes on the ledger. The page blurred slightly, and she blinked it clear. "Tell Roy I said thank you," she said. "Tell him yourself. He'll act like it embarrasses him, but he'll appreciate it." After he left, she sat very still for a moment. Then she went back to the letters. The night before the meeting, Harold Finch came to the ranch. Not with paperwork and not in daylight. He came at 8 o'clock in the evening with his 2 hired men behind him, and he rode right up to the front gate like a man who owned the approach, if not yet the property, and he called out in the carrying voice he used when he wanted to be heard and respected simultaneously. "Blackwood, I have business with your household." Gideon was on the porch. He had seen them coming. Roy had ridden a quiet patrol around the south approach every evening for the past 4 days, exactly for this reason. And he stood with his arms crossed and his face in its most readable blank expression. Eliza was in the doorway behind him. She'd heard the hoofbeats. She'd known, the way you always know certain sounds when you've been listening for them long enough. She came out onto the porch and stood beside Gideon. Harold Finch had not changed. That was the first thing she registered, and it was absurd to be surprised by it. But she was anyway. He was the same compact, well-dressed man with the silver-threaded hair and the clean hands and the smile that was always slightly ahead of his actual expression, like he'd pasted it on half a second early. He was 51 years old, and he looked prosperous and reasonable and nothing at all like what he was. He looked at Eliza, the smile stretched. "There she is," he said. Not to her, to Gideon, like she was something that had been misplaced and was now, gratifyingly, found. "State your business," Gideon said. "My business is a private matter between myself and my ward." He shifted slightly on his horse. "I've come a considerable distance, Mr. Blackwood. I'm sure we can resolve this civilly." "She's not your ward," Gideon said. "She's a grown woman. She came here of her own accord. She came here in breach of an existing domestic arrangement." Harold's tone stayed pleasant. That was always how he started. "I'm not here to cause difficulty. I'm here to bring her home, where she belongs, and to discuss reasonable compensation for the trouble her departure caused." Gideon didn't move. "You're on private property. You weren't invited." "Mr. Blackwood." The pleasantness acquired a slight edge. "I have documentation establishing my legal standing in this matter. I suggest we discuss it inside like civilized men, rather than—" "Whatever you have isn't worth the paper it's on," Eliza said. Her own voice surprised her. Not the words, she'd been thinking about what to say for days, but the steadiness of it. The fact that it came out level and clear and without any of the shrinking quality it used to have when she spoke in his direction. Harold looked at her. The smile dropped about 3 degrees. "Eliza," he said. Different tone now. The private tone. The one he used when the audience was small. "You're confused. You've been in a difficult situation and someone has taken advantage of your vulnerability. I understand that. But you know, at the end of the day, that I'm the only one who—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. Not because she'd told him to. Harold Finch had never stopped because someone told him to, but because something in her face made him recalculate. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I've been listening to you say it my whole life. You kept me fed and housed, and in exchange for that, I owe you everything, including the right to make decisions about where I go and who I speak to and what I'm allowed to become." She came to the edge of the porch. Her hands were at her sides. "I kept your accounts for 8 years. I ran your household for 8 years. The debt, if there is one, runs the other direction." Harold's pleasant expression had hardened into something more honest. "You signed a document that has no legal force. I was never your servant by contract. I was your family's dependent by circumstance, and I'm not anymore." She looked at him steadily. "You can take your papers to the county office. You can take them to a judge in Cheyenne. You can take them anywhere you want, but you cannot take me because I am not yours." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a confrontation that has shifted in a direction that surprises everyone, including some of the people involved. Harold looked at Gideon. His face had settled into something flat and cold, and this was the face she knew better than the pleasant one, because this was the face that came after the pleasantness had stopped working. "You've coached her," he said. "I've done nothing but listen to her," Gideon said. "She's a frightened young woman who found the first available escape route and—" "I want you off my property," Gideon said. His voice was very quiet. "Tonight. And I want you to understand that if you come back, I'll have the county sheriff escort you out. I've already been in contact with his office." This was news to Eliza, though she didn't show it. Harold looked between them. His 2 hired men sat their horses behind him without expression, which told her they were the kind of men who went where they were pointed and didn't particularly care about the destination. "You think this is over," Harold said. He addressed Gideon, but his eyes were on Eliza. "It's not over." "Not yet," Gideon agreed, "but it's over for tonight." Harold turned his horse. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, with the deliberateness of a man who was making sure you understood that leaving was his idea. His men turned behind him. Before he rode out of the yard, he looked back once over his shoulder at Eliza. It was a long look, with a lot in it, and she met it without moving. Then he was gone, and the yard was quiet, and Gideon said without turning around, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. She was shaking slightly, which she hadn't noticed until just now. She pressed her arms against her sides. "You contacted the sheriff?" 2 days ago. "You didn't tell me." "I was going to. Today got long." He turned then and looked at her face, and his expression did something complicated and then settled back into itself. "Come inside." "I'm fine." "I know you are. Come inside anyway." She came inside. Mabel was in the kitchen, not pretending she hadn't been listening, and she handed Eliza a cup of coffee that was about 60% coffee and 40% something that burned pleasantly going down. Eliza sat at the table and let the shaking work its way out of her hands. "He'll be at the meeting tomorrow," she said, "with Crow." "Probably," Gideon said. "He's going to say publicly what he couldn't make me believe privately." She thought about it with the deliberate care of someone constructing a fortification. He needs an audience. He always did. He needs people to believe he's the reasonable one. And you need people who know differently. The neighbors. Bill, Clara, the Suttons. They've heard what he's done to this ranch and what Crow's been doing. If they'll speak up. "I already asked them," Gideon said. She looked at him. "When I rode to Halloran's yesterday," he said, "I asked all three. Clara said, and I'm quoting directly, that she wouldn't miss it for the world." Something loosened in Eliza's chest that had been tight for a long time. She drank the coffee. She went upstairs. She locked the door. Old habit, old comfort, and lay down on the real mattress and stared at the ceiling while the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the ranch breathed around her, steady and substantial, refusing to be afraid. The Millhaven feed hall could hold about 60 people if everyone stood close enough together and nobody was overly sensitive about proximity. By the time Gideon's wagon pulled up, it looked like it was going to be asked to hold 75. Ranchers, wives, a few townspeople, 2 men she didn't recognize who had the careful, watchful quality of men paid to observe. Silas Crow was already inside. She could see through the open doors, standing near the front with the ease of a man comfortable in rooms he intends to own. Harold Finch was beside him. She'd expected that. She'd prepared for it. Her stomach still did something unpleasant when she saw them standing together, the two of them, her 2 different kinds of problem aligned into one. Bill Halloran was near the door. He nodded at Gideon and his eyes moved briefly to Eliza with something that might have been encouragement. Clara Marsh was already inside in the 3rd row with the posture of a woman who has selected her seat strategically. The Sutton brothers, there were 3 of them, quiet men, farmers rather than ranchers, with the battered hands of people who spent their days close to the ground, were near the back wall. Gideon let her in without touching her, which was the right call and which she appreciated. She was not an accessory to his entrance. She was there in her own right. Crow noticed them immediately. His eyes moved from Gideon to Eliza with the quick, cataloging look of a man updating his assessment, and then he smiled, and it was not a smile anyone should trust. "Blackwood," he said. "Glad you came. And this must be Miss Mercer." "It is," Eliza said. He looked at her with the genial attention of a man who's decided you're not worth being cautious about. "Well, I hope this evening's discussion will be useful to you. We're all trying to solve the same problem out here. Make the territory work for everyone." "That's what we're hoping," she said pleasantly, and went to find her seat. Harold, across the room, said nothing and watched her with his particular flat, calculating attention. She felt it on the back of her neck and chose not to acknowledge it. The meeting began. Crow ran it with this particular skill of a man who has presided over many rooms. He kept things warm and reasonable, let other people talk just long enough to feel heard, and steered every discussion back toward the conclusion he'd already written. He proposed a water management cooperative, which sounded reasonable until you read the terms he sketched out, at which point it became clear that the cooperative would be managed by a board of 3, and 2 of those 3 would be people he had selected. The room stirred slightly. Not revolt, not yet, but the particular restlessness of people who sense the shape of a thing they don't like without yet being able to name it. Gideon said, "Who owns the decisions the board makes?" "The board acts for the cooperative," Crow said, "for the good of all." "Who's accountable if the board makes a decision that damages someone's existing water rights?" A pause. "The cooperative's charter would address that." "I'd like to see that charter before I agree to anything." "Of course. I have it with me. Then I'd like to see it now," Gideon said, "before we go further." The room shifted again. Crow's smile thinned by a fraction. He produced the charter. Copies were passed around. Eliza read hers in approximately 90 seconds, because she had read a great many legal documents in the past 2 months and had learned to find the important sentences quickly. She found them. They were in paragraph 4, written in the kind of language designed to sound comprehensive while being carefully vague about liability. She stood up. "Miss Mercer," Crow said, with the particular tone of a man who has just registered that someone he discounted is about to become a problem. The charter establishes the board's authority over water allocation, she said, addressing the room rather than Crow, because the room was who mattered. But paragraph 4 removes individual ranchers' rights to contest board decisions through existing county mechanisms. That means if the board decides to reallocate water rights that are currently yours by legal standing, you can't appeal to the county. You can only appeal to the board. She paused. The same board controlled by 2 of Mr. Crow's associates. The room went very quiet. That's not a cooperative, Bill Halloran said from his seat. That's a takeover with paperwork. Crow's face had gone smooth and careful in a way that Eliza recognized. It was the same thing Harold's face did when the pleasantness had been pushed past its useful point. I think you're misreading. I'll read it out loud, she said. If anyone wants to follow along. She started reading paragraph 4. Her voice was level and clear, and she read every word without editorializing. She didn't need to editorialize. The paragraph editorialized itself. By the time she finished, 3 more people had stood up. Not all at once, one at a time, the Sutton brothers, and then a rancher named George Webb, whom she didn't know personally, but who apparently had his own reasons to be unhappy about Crow's operations. Each of them said something specific. A fence cut here, a water source disrupted there, a survey marker that had somehow moved between one season and the next. Crow was on his feet. He was keeping his voice controlled, but it had acquired the edge she'd heard through the window of Harold's house when Harold was losing an argument. These are unsubstantiated allegations from people who, they're documented, Eliza said. He looked at her. The chemical analysis of the Blackwood Ranch South Well, conducted by Dr. Haverfield of Mill Haven, dated October 14th. Deliberate introduction of lye compound, not consistent with natural contamination. She held up the second page. A copy filed with the county office on October 18th, received and stamped by the county clerk. She held up the third. The livestock theft report filed October 21st, noting 23 head of Blackwood cattle found on or near the boundary of the Crown Sea property. The room was silent in the specific way that rooms go silent when something has shifted and everyone is adjusting to the new weight of things. Harold moved. She felt it before she saw it. He stepped forward from the wall where he'd been standing, and he said, in his carrying, reasonable voice, I think it's worth noting that this young woman has a history of fabrication and instability, and that her— What is your business here, Mr. Finch? Clara Marsh said. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Clara Marsh had been running her own operation in this valley for 11 years, and the tone she used was the tone of someone who has already decided an outcome and is simply waiting for the facts to arrange themselves accordingly. You're not a rancher in this valley. You have no stake in the water rights. What exactly are you doing at a community meeting? Harold turned his reasonable smile toward Clara. I'm a concerned party in a related matter. The related matter being that you want to collect a young woman who left your household of her own free will, Clara said, which has nothing whatsoever to do with water rights, and which is exactly the kind of distraction we don't need tonight. Several people in the room who had not known about the Harold situation were now learning about it from their neighbors in low, rapid murmurs. Eliza watched the information move across the room like weather. Harold's composure slipped, just briefly, just enough. She signed a binding agreement. Then take it to a judge, Clara said. Don't take it to a water management meeting in Wyoming and expect it to count for anything. Someone in the back laughed. Not cruelly, just the laughter of recognition, the sound a room makes when it sees through something. Harold looked at Eliza. She was ready for that look. She'd been ready for it since the night on the porch, since before that, since the morning she'd put his letters in her coat lining and started planning. I'm not afraid of you, she said. It wasn't loud, but the room was quiet enough that it didn't need to be. I've been afraid of you for 20 years. I'm telling you clearly, in front of these people, that I am not coming back, and that everything you have told people about who I am and why I left is a lie. He opened his mouth. I kept your accounts, she said. I kept them accurately, and I kept them honest, and in return you kept me isolated and controlled and terrified. That is the truth. And I will say it to any judge in any county in this territory if you want to make this a legal matter. She looked at him steadily. Do you? The room was completely silent. Harold Finch stood in front of 60-some-odd strangers who were looking at him with the fresh, undisguised assessment of people who had just heard something they believed. He stood there long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then he picked up his coat from the chair beside him and walked toward the door without speaking, and his 2 hired men went with him, and the door closed behind them. The room breathed. Then it started talking, all at once, the low, urgent conversation of people deciding where they stand. Crow had recovered. He was already moving, trying to re-establish the terms. "This has been a productive discussion," he said, with the particular determination of a man who has watched his plan go sideways and is refusing to acknowledge it. "I think we should—" "I'd like to make a motion," Bill Halloran said, "that this community declines to recognize the proposed cooperative in its current form and requests that any future proposal include an independent legal review open to all participants." "Seconded," said George Webb. "All in favor?" Mabel said. She was in the back row because Mabel had come to the meeting and nobody had asked her to, and that was entirely Mabel, and her voice cut through the room with absolute authority. The ayes had it. By a considerable margin. Crow stood at the front of the room with the charter in his hand and the particular expression of a man recalculating the degree to which he had miscalculated. He looked at Eliza once, and it was not a warm look, and she met it without difficulty. He left without speaking to her. Outside, in the cold air of a Wyoming November evening, Gideon came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked out at the road where Harold's hired men were climbing back onto their horses and riding south, and at the crowned sea wagon moving in the opposite direction, and at the neighbors filing out around them, some of them stopping to shake hands with Gideon. One of them, George Webb, a large, sun-cracked man she hadn't met, stopping to look at her and say simply, "Good work tonight," before walking to his own wagon. Cody appeared at her other elbow. He said nothing, but he was grinning broadly enough for all 3 of them. Roy was bringing the wagon around. He'd stayed outside the whole meeting. She thought she understood that. Roy was a man who showed up, not a man who made speeches. And she appreciated it the way she appreciated all the different shapes that support could take. "He'll come back," she said quietly to Gideon. "About Harold. About Crow." She didn't specify. "I know. Tonight didn't end it." "No." He looked down at her. "But it changed it." She thought about that. She thought about the room going silent when she read the paragraph. She thought about Harold's face at the moment when the reasonable argument stopped working. "It changed it," she agreed. The wagon pulled up. Roy sat on the bench with the reins and the careful non-expression of a man who has absolutely not been waiting to see how things went. She climbed up without help. The night was cold and clear, and the stars above the Wyoming territory were the particular brilliant stars of altitude and distance, with no city light to dim them, and Blackwood Ranch was somewhere to the north in the dark, waiting. She had done what she came to do tonight. She had said what needed to be said. Her hands were steady. But she was under no illusion that this was finished. Crow had money and patience and the particular stubbornness of a man who was not accustomed to rooms full of people saying no. And Harold, somewhere south on the road to Mill Haven, was doing what Harold always did when he lost a round. Sitting with it, calculating, looking for the angle he'd missed. She would have to find that angle first. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and looked out at the dark road ahead, and the wagon carried them home through the cold and the quiet, and the stars burned steadily over everything, impartial and enormous, and she was still here, and that was what mattered. She was still here, and she was not done. The morning after the meeting, Gideon made coffee before 5 o'clock and drank it standing at the kitchen window, while the dark pressed flat against the glass, and Eliza came downstairs at 5:15 and found him there, and poured her own cup and stood beside him without speaking, and for a while they just watched the dark together. It was Gideon who said, finally, "He's going to try something else." "I know." "Crow or Finch?" "Maybe both." "Crow has more to lose and more resources to lose it with," she said. "Harold is angrier, but he's also more predictable when he's angry. He makes mistakes when he's been embarrassed." She thought about the meeting room, about Harold's face when the room laughed. "He'll push hard and fast, something designed to look like it was my idea." Gideon looked at her sideways. "What does that mean?" "It means he's done it before. When someone crossed him in Baltimore, a business partner, a supplier who went to the authorities, Harold found a way to make it look like the other person had behaved badly first. Set up a situation, manufactured evidence, found a witness who could be persuaded to remember things a certain way." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He'll try to make it look like I stole from him, or that I damaged his business reputation deliberately. Something with paperwork behind it. Then we make sure our paperwork is stronger. We already do, but I want a lawyer. She looked at him. The one I wrote to in Cheyenne. Has he responded? Letter came yesterday. I forgot to give it to you. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a somewhat battered envelope. She took it, opened it, read it while standing at the window. The lawyer's name was Edmund Price, and he wrote in clear, careful sentences with no wasted language, which she appreciated. He said he was familiar with the type of domestic arrangement she described, and that such arrangements carried no binding legal force on an adult woman in the Wyoming territory. He also said, in a final paragraph that she read twice, that if she wished to file a preemptive documentation of the situation with his office, he would retain it and it would constitute a dated legal record of the facts as she stated them, one that would be considerably more difficult for anyone to dismiss than a verbal account after the fact. She folded the letter. I need to go to Cheyenne. Gideon took the letter back, read it himself, handed it back. When? Soon, before Harold does something that requires me to respond instead of act. She looked at him. I know the timing is bad. With Crow still, the timing is what it is, he said. I'll take you. You don't have to. I know. He finished his coffee and set the cup in the basin. I'll take you. They left 2 days later, before sunrise, in the good wagon with the team Gideon kept for long hauls. Hector had the ranch. Roy had the fence line and the well monitoring and a standing instruction that if anything moved on the Crown seaside of the property boundary, he was to send word immediately to Mill Haven and to the county sheriff both. The ride to Cheyenne was 6 hours on a decent road and considerably longer on the road they actually had, which was not decent, though it had ambitions. They talked some and were quiet some, and neither felt the need to account for which was which. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, when the mountains were properly visible to the west and the sky had settled into its midday gray, Gideon said, I want to ask you something. All right. The arrangement. The reason you answered the agency. She looked at the road ahead. What about it? I want to know if it was just an exit from Finch, or if there was something else in it. She considered that for a mile or so of rough road. I read your letters, she said finally. Both of them. I read a lot of correspondence from the agency. The other men wrote things like, I am a good Christian man with moderate temper, and I require a wife of domestic disposition and pleasing character. She paused. You wrote that you weren't looking for beauty or sweetness, that you wanted someone who wasn't afraid of hard things. That's what I meant. That's why I answered yours. She looked at him. You described a situation honestly. You didn't make it sound better than it was. You didn't promise things to get what you wanted. She turned back to the road. I had spent 20 years living with a man who never told the truth about anything if a lie would serve better. Your letter read like someone who hadn't learned that trick yet. He was quiet for a moment. Or someone who tried it and found it more trouble than it's worth. Have you? When I was younger, before the ranch, during the war, toward the end. He said the last part without elaboration, and she understood that the war was a country he could enter briefly but not stay in. I learned that people who make decisions based on things that aren't true tend to end up in situations they're not equipped for. Harold spent his whole life lying to make situations go the direction he wanted, she said, and then being surprised when they fell apart. And here he is in Wyoming. And here he is? She let out a slow breath. I didn't know if I could trust the letter. I almost didn't write back. But I had $40 saved over 3 years and a 3-week window while Harold was in New York on business. And the options were answer the letter or answer nothing, and answering nothing meant staying. So it was partly an exit. Yes. I won't pretend it wasn't. She looked at her hands. But I wanted it to be real. Whatever it turned out to be. I wanted to be somewhere that was real. She paused. The ranch is real. The work is real. You are... She stopped. I'm real, he said, with the ghost of something that wasn't quite amusement but lived in the same neighborhood. Inconveniently so, she said. He didn't laugh, but his shoulders changed slightly. They rode on. Edmund Price had an office above a dry goods store on the main street of Cheyenne, reached by an exterior staircase that needed work and a door that didn't quite fit its frame. None of this diminished him. He was a man of about 50 with the posture of someone who spent his days making arguments, and the eyes of someone who spent his evenings reading, and the handshake of someone who knew that first impressions were a form of evidence. He shook Eliza's hand first. She noticed that. She laid out the situation in 30 minutes with the documents she'd brought. He asked precise questions. He made notes. He did not look shocked by anything she said, which told her either that he had heard worse or that he was a man who understood that looking shocked was rarely useful. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a long moment. Then he looked up. "The domestic arrangement Mr. Finch is referencing has no force in this territory," he said. "What he may attempt to do is file a civil claim for damages, lost services, breach of implied contract, that kind of thing. It's frivolous, and I can defeat it, but it would take time and it would require your presence in Cheyenne at least once, possibly twice." "I can do that." "Good." He made another note. "The more pressing concern, in my view, is the combination of his presence and Mr. Crow's activities. Two parties with different grievances who have found temporary common cause against the same household. That's a situation that tends to escalate toward a single confronting moment rather than a series of small legal skirmishes." He looked at her directly. "Do you understand what I mean?" "You mean they'll stop using paperwork eventually?" "If the paperwork isn't working, yes. Men like Crow don't typically accept a loss at a community meeting and walk away. And men like Finch, Baptisi," he paused, choosing words carefully, "tend to make things personal when they feel publicly humiliated. What do you recommend?" "Document everything that happens from this point forward. Date, time, witnesses. If either party appears on your property without invitation, that is documented. If you receive any correspondence from either, that is retained." He leaned forward. "And I would like to file a sworn statement from you today, in this office, establishing the facts of the domestic situation and your current legal standing. It costs you an hour of your time, and it costs Finch considerably more effort to overcome than he probably anticipates." She looked at Gideon. He was sitting to her left, silent throughout, in the particular silence of a man who understands that this conversation is not his to lead. "Do it," he said. She gave the sworn statement. It took the hour Price had promised. By the time they emerged back onto the staircase landing, the afternoon was cooling rapidly and the street below was in shadow. "He'll file something within the week," she said, "when he finds out I've been here." "How will he find out?" She looked at Gideon. "Because he always finds out. He has someone watching, or someone who talks, or he simply reads situations accurately and acts on what he reads." She started down the stairs. "I've never been able to surprise him. I've only ever been able to be ready." "Then we'll be ready." What they came back to was a ranch that had been busy in their absence in ways that were not entirely welcome. Hector met them in the yard with the expression of a man who has been managing several problems simultaneously and is very glad to see someone with authority arrive. Roy was behind him with his arms crossed and his jaw set. "Crow's men were on the north fence all day yesterday," Hector said. "Not crossing, just watching. 6 of them, which is more than we've seen before." "Anything on the south line?" "Quiet. But Pete found tracks near the east water access this morning. Looked like 2 horses, overnight." Gideon climbed down from the wagon. "They're mapping us. Where we patrol, how often, where the gaps are." "That's what Roy said." "Roy's right." He looked at the ranch, the barn, the paddock, the bunkhouse, the house, with the assessing gaze of a man updating his understanding of a defensive situation. "I want someone on each fence line, night and day, rotating. I want it organized so Crow can see that we're watching back." "That's 8 men on rotation plus the regular work," Hector said carefully. "We're going to get thin." "I know. Can you do it?" A pause. "Yes." "Then do it." Eliza was already moving toward the house. She had been on the road for 12 hours, and she needed to think, and she thought better when she could see her files. But Cody fell into step beside her with the slightly anxious energy he used when he had news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "What?" she said. "Finch was in town today." She kept walking. "I expected that." "He went to see Reverend—" Cody stopped. "The pastor at the Millhaven Church. I don't know what he said, but the pastor went to see Mayor Aldridge afterward, and Aldridge sent a message out to the ranch asking Gideon to come in for a conversation at his convenience." She stopped walking. "Harold," she said, more to herself than to Cody. She understood immediately, completely, the way you understand a chess move 3 turns early when you know the player. He couldn't win legally, and he'd been embarrassed publicly, so now he was working the community. The concerned guardian. The man who had raised a troubled young woman and tracked her across the country out of worry for her welfare. He would be very convincing. He had always been very convincing to people who had no reason not to believe him. "What does Gideon think?" she asked. "I haven't told him yet. You two just got back." She turned around. Gideon was still in the yard with Hector. She walked back to him and waited for a pause in their conversation. "Harold went to see the town pastor today," she said, "and then the mayor wants a meeting. Gideon went still in that way he had. What is he saying?" "I don't know exactly, but I can tell you the shape of it." She kept her voice even. "He's telling them he's worried about me, that I've been in a fragile state, that I was taken advantage of by an unscrupulous arrangement, and he came all this way to help." She paused. "He will say it with complete sincerity, because he always does, and people who don't know him will have no reason to question it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, "So we go see the mayor?" "Yes." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, before Harold has another day to work the room." He looked at her. "You up for it?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm doing it anyway." He nodded, and that was that. Mayor Aldridge was a careful man who had held his position for 11 years by being exactly careful enough to avoid most of the decisions that would have cost him the job, and a few of the ones that might have made him genuinely good at it. He received them in his office with the cautious warmth of a man who was hoping this conversation would sort itself out without requiring him to take a side. Harold was not there. She'd wondered if he would be. "Mr. Blackwood," Aldridge said, shaking hands. He looked at Eliza with the slightly uncertain expression of a man trying to reconcile 2 different descriptions of the same person. "Miss Mercer." "Thank you for seeing us," she said. "Of course, of course." He gestured at the chairs. They sat. He sat. He arranged his hands on his desk. "I wanted to speak with you directly because, well, a concerned party came to my attention yesterday, and as mayor I have a responsibility to make sure all residents of this area are—" "What exactly did Harold Finch tell you?" she said. Aldridge blinked at the directness. "He expressed concern for your welfare. He described a history of emotional difficulty, some troubles with—" "He told you I was unstable," she said, "and possibly that I had some kind of episode or breakdown that led me to leave his household precipitously." "He used the word fragile," Aldridge said carefully. "Did he show you any documentation, medical records, letters, anything with dates?" A pause. "He had a letter. From a physician in Baltimore." She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. Neither of them had anticipated this, and she could see from his face that he was recalibrating the same way she was. "I would like to see that letter," she said. "If you'll permit it." Aldridge hesitated. Then he opened his desk drawer and produced a folded sheet. She took it and read it. It looked like a physician's letter. It had a letterhead and a signature and medical language that sounded authoritative. It described a young woman with episodes of paranoid ideation, difficulty separating real grievances from imagined ones, a pattern of making accusations against authority figures when under stress. She read it twice. Then she put it on Aldridge's desk. "The physician named on this letterhead is a man named Caldwell," she said. "He did examine me once, in 1882, when I was 16 years old and had been in Harold Finch's household for 8 years. Harold took me to him because I had told my school teacher that Harold had hit me." She kept her voice level. "Dr. Caldwell was Harold's personal physician. He had treated Harold's family for 12 years. He found no evidence of abuse and noted that I seemed prone to exaggeration when anxious." She paused. "He was paid to find what he found." Aldridge looked uncomfortable. "I have a sworn legal statement filed this week with an attorney in Cheyenne," she said, "documenting the facts of my situation in my own words, under oath, with dates. I also have 4 years of account ledgers that I kept for Harold Finch's shipping business, which show that I was performing skilled professional work on his behalf from the age of 14 onward, without wages, which is not how you treat a dependent you're caring for out of generosity." She folded her hands. "I'm not fragile, Mayor Aldridge. I'm informed. There's a difference, and Harold has been counting on people not knowing it." The office was very quiet. Aldridge looked at the letter on his desk, then at her, then at Gideon, who had said absolutely nothing throughout, and whose silence, she understood now, had been entirely deliberate. This was her room to hold, and he had understood that before they walked in. "What would you like from me?" Aldridge said. "I'd like you to hold that letter," she said. "Don't give it back to him. And I'd like you to understand that if Harold Finch or anyone associated with him makes representations about my mental state or personal history to anyone in this town, I will respond publicly and with documentation." She stood. "I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to have accurate information before you do." She and Gideon left. In the street outside, Cody was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face and decided not to ask questions, which was the right call. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was different from the comfortable silences. This one had weight and shape and the particular tension of a situation that has one more turn in it before it resolves. The turn came 4 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated, which was her own error, and she acknowledged it without forgiving herself for it. It was Mabel who saw it first. Mabel, who had been on the property 12 years and who knew the look of the land well enough to know when something on it was wrong. She came into the office where Eliza was working and said, without preamble, "There's a man on the ridge above the north pasture. Been there an hour. He's not one of Crow's regulars." Eliza was on her feet before Mabel finished the sentence. "Where's Gideon?" "South barn." She went to the south barn at something faster than a walk and found Gideon replacing a hinge on a stall door with the focused patience of physical work. She told him what Mabel had said. He put down the hinge and went to the tack room for his field glass without wasting time on questions. The man on the ridge was Harold's man. Gideon identified him from the horse, a specific gray roan he'd noted when Harold rode into the yard that first evening. He was not doing anything. He was watching the ranch the same way Crow's men had watched the fence lines, and the combination of the two, Crow's men on the boundaries, Harold's man on the ridge, was the shape of a pincer in early stages. "They're going to move at the same time," she said, "within the next day or two." Gideon lowered the field glass. "Crow doesn't wait. He's patient up to a point and then he acts." "What does acting look like for him?" "Last time someone resisted him this long, he burned a hay barn." He said it plainly, not to frighten her, just to give her the information. "Sutton Place, 3 years ago, before the Suttons sold and moved east. It was never proved." She thought about the winter hay supply she'd counted in October, about the barn with the new lumber section, about the 72 head of cattle in the north pasture that couldn't be moved quickly. "We need to get the Hallorans and Clara here," she said. "And we need to send for the sheriff tonight, not tomorrow, because tomorrow might be too late." He looked at her. "If we call the sheriff and nothing happens, we look like we're crying wolf. Crow will use that." "I know. But if we don't and something burns, we can't undo it." She met his eyes. "What's your read?" He was quiet for the 5 seconds it took him to actually think about it rather than just respond. "It moves tonight," he said. "The man on the ridge is a last look. Crow doesn't send someone to look unless the plan is already in motion. Then send for the sheriff now." He sent Cody at a gallop with a written message for the county sheriff. He sent Danny to Halloran's with a different message. He sent Roy to Clara Marsh. Then he came back to the house and found Eliza in the office, where she had pulled the water rights documents and the chemical analysis and the theft report and all the correspondence with Price and laid them in order on the desk. "What are you doing?" he said. "Making sure that if anything happens tonight, everything is organized so it can be found and read by someone who doesn't know the filing system." She tied the stack with twine. "This is the legal record. Everything is here. Even if—" She stopped. "Nothing's going to burn," he said. "But if it did, it won't." He came to the desk and put his hand on hers briefly, just long enough to stop the motion. "Eliza." She looked at him. His face, in the lamplight, had the carved quality she'd noticed the first day and understood better now. The marks of a man who had learned to keep his expression still. Because in the situations he'd lived through, visible emotion was a luxury he couldn't always afford. But his eyes were different, and had been for some time, and she was not inexperienced at reading things people didn't say directly. "We are not losing this ranch," he said, "or anything on it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put the documents in the locked cabinet in the barn, the same cabinet that had always held the water rights, and she locked it and put the key in her pocket. When she came back, Hector was organizing the hands by the barn. Who would watch which line, who would stay near the house, who would watch the hay store. Roy had come back from Clara's with the message that Clara was bringing 2 of her own hands and would be there before midnight. Bill Halloran's response was already en route. The ranch prepared itself in the particular quiet efficiency of people who have been thinking about this moment for weeks and have, each in their own way, already decided what they will do when it comes. Mabel made food because Mabel's response to any situation that required endurance was to make sure everyone could endure it on a full stomach. Cody came back from the sheriff's at 9 o'clock with the deputy rather than the sheriff himself, which was not ideal but was something. The deputy's name was Marsh, no relation to Clara, and he was a young man who seemed uncertain about several things, but had the good sense to listen when Gideon laid out the situation in plain, documented terms. Harold arrived at 10, not with his hired men this time, alone, which was unusual enough that Eliza watched him ride into the yard from the porch window with a heightened attention, trying to read what it meant. He dismounted at the gate and called out, and Gideon went out to meet him, and Eliza followed 2 steps behind because she was done with waiting indoors. "I came to talk," Harold said. He looked at the deputy on the porch with an expression that was difficult to parse. Surprise, recalculation, something else. "Privately." "There's nothing private about this situation anymore," Gideon said. "Gideon." Harold's voice shifted into the register she recognized as his most dangerous, reasonable, almost warm, the voice he used when he'd decided that being pleasant would serve better than being threatening. "I have no quarrel with you, truly. I understand that you acted in good faith. You believed what she told you." He glanced at Eliza. "But you don't know her history. You don't know the full picture." "Then tell me," Gideon said, in front of the deputy. "Tell me the full picture." Harold's pleasant expression held for 2 more seconds. Then it dropped, completely. And what was underneath was not rage exactly, but something colder. The expression of a man who has decided that the soft approach has failed and is moving to the next option. "I know what Crow is planning," he said. It was addressed to Gideon, but he was watching Eliza. "I can stop it. I have enough on him to take him apart legally. He brought me in to help manage the pressure on this ranch, and I have the correspondence to prove it." He paused. "I'll give it to you. All of it. Everything I know about his operations, his contacts in the county office, his plans." The yard was very quiet. "In exchange for what?" Gideon said. It was not a question. "She comes back with me, willingly, or at least without a fight." He looked at Eliza. "I'm not a monster. I'm a man protecting a business arrangement that she disrupted without warning or compensation. I'll take her home, she'll work out a reasonable period, and then she's free. I give you my word." His word. Eliza heard herself say, "No." Not loud, not angry, just the word, placed precisely. Harold turned to her. "Eliza." "No," she said again. "I'm not a bargaining piece. I was never a bargaining piece, and I'm not going to pretend that agreeing to be one is a solution." She stepped to Gideon's side, not behind him, beside him. "If you have evidence against Crow, give it to the deputy. It's the right thing to do, and it has nothing to do with me." "You're not being reasonable. I am being precise," she said, "which you always mistook for the same thing." Harold looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. She thought about the boarding house room and the train and the 43 cents and the key in the lock and the real mattress and the months of work and the meeting and Price's office and every single day she had spent here building something that was hers, that was real, that existed entirely outside the world he had kept her in. She held his gaze and did not move. Something happened in his face that she had never seen there before. It was not defeat exactly. It was more like the moment when a man understands that the person across from him is no longer the person he planned for, and he doesn't have a plan for who she is now. He looked away first. He reached into his coat. The deputy's hand moved toward his holster, stopped when Harold produced a packet of folded documents, rather than anything else. He held them out. Not to Eliza. Not to Gideon. To the deputy. "Crow's correspondence with the county clerk," he said, 3 years' worth, and his plan for the valley water system. He dropped it into the deputy's hand without meeting anyone's eyes. "I want no trouble. I want to go home." The deputy took the packet. His expression suggested he was going to have a complicated evening. Harold remounted his horse. He straightened his coat with the practiced gesture of a man maintaining dignity as a matter of form. He looked at Eliza once more, and the look was not warm and not cold, but something flattened and distant, like a landscape seen from too far away to make out the details. "You've changed," he said. "I know," she said. He rode out of the yard and did not look back. The deputy opened the packet right there in the lamplight with Gideon and Eliza reading over his shoulder, and what was in it was what Harold had said it was. 3 years of letters between Silas Crow and the county clerk, with numbers and dates that would take a careful legal mind time to work through, but that were, even on first reading, clearly the shape of something corrupt and well documented. At 11:15, 3 men were seen riding hard away from Crow's property in the direction of the Eastern Territorial Line, which the deputy noted in his report. At midnight, Silas Crow himself arrived at the Blackwood Ranch gate with a lawyer and a face the color of old ash. The conversation that followed was not warm. It lasted 40 minutes. Clara Marsh sat in the corner with her arms folded and witnessed all of it. At the end, Crow signed 3 documents that the lawyer had apparently been forced to produce on very short notice: a withdrawal of the water rights contest, a settlement for the 23 head of stolen cattle, and an acknowledgement that the proposed cooperative charter would not be refiled in its current or substantially similar form. He signed them with the deliberate, controlled signature of a man who has been beaten and knows it and will not show more than that. When he left, the deputy rode behind him to make sure he reached town, which Clara had specifically requested and the deputy had agreed to with only slight embarrassment. The ranch was quiet. Cody sat down on the porch steps and let out a very long breath. Roy, beside the barn door, took off his hat and rubbed his face with both hands, which was more expression than she had ever seen from him in 2 months. Hector went inside and came back out with the bottle of whiskey he kept for medical emergencies, which this arguably qualified as. Gideon stood in the yard and looked at the documents in his hand: the signed settlement, the withdrawal, the acknowledgement, with the expression of a man who is waiting to feel something and is not quite sure what form it will arrive in. Eliza stood beside him. The night was very cold and very clear, and the stars did what Wyoming stars did, which was burn with the impartial brightness of things that have been there a very long time. "It's not all done," she said, quietly. "Crow still has money, and Price will need to make sure the county clerk situation is properly investigated. And Harold, I know. He'll lick his wounds. He won't come back, but he'll find ways to—" Eliza. He said her name in the way he occasionally said it when he wanted her to stop moving forward for a moment. She stopped. He looked at her. "It's enough for tonight." She looked at what she'd been doing, cataloging the remaining risks, because that was what she did. Because she had learned a long time ago that safety was only ever provisional and the work of maintaining it was never finished. She looked at Gideon's face in the cold lamplight, and the documents in his hand, and the ranch around them, Roy and Cody and Hector and Mabel inside at the table, and Clara Marsh drinking someone's coffee in the kitchen with the satisfied air of a woman who has attended a good event, and Bill Halloran's wagon just visible at the barn, his 2 hands sleeping in the bunkhouse because they'd ridden here tonight and had nowhere close to ride back to. All of this built in 2 months out of a suitcase and 43 cents and a letter from a man who wrote the truth because lying was more trouble than it was worth. "All right," she said. They went inside. Mabel had made something hot that nobody asked the name of, and it was very good. And Eliza sat at the kitchen table she had eaten at every night since September and let herself be warm, and for a while, not long, but enough, she stopped planning the next thing and simply stayed in the present one. It was, she thought, a thing she was going to need to practice. But she had time. The county investigation into the clerk's office opened on a Tuesday in early December, which was the same week. The first real snow came to Mill Haven and buried everything under 8 inches of white that made the world look temporary and clean. Eliza heard about the investigation from Price, who sent a letter that arrived in the Thursday mail pouch. She read it at the kitchen table with Gideon across from her, and Mabel making something at the stove that smelled like onions and winter and normalcy. Price wrote that the Territorial Marshal's office had taken the crow-to-clerk correspondence seriously enough to assign 2 investigators, and that the county clerk had already, in Price's dry legal phrasing, indicated a willingness to cooperate with the inquiry in exchange for favorable consideration of his own situation, which meant he was talking, which meant Crow's 3 years of careful construction was being taken apart from the inside. "It'll take months," she said. "Probably." Gideon poured coffee into both cups without being asked, which was a small thing and had become a natural thing, and she noticed it the way she had learned to notice the small, consistent things, as the actual substance of a life rather than the interruptions to it. Crow's not going to just sit in his house while they investigate him. No. But he's going to sit quietly. He's got enough legal trouble that adding to it by doing something visible is not in his interest. He set the coffee pot down. He's not done, but he's contained. For now. For now, he agreed, which was the honest answer, and the honest answer was what she'd come to expect from him. She folded Price's letter and added it to the file she kept in the office, the Crow file, which had become substantial enough to require its own section of the cabinet. She was meticulous about it in the way she was meticulous about the ledgers, because she had learned from Harold that the record of a thing was sometimes the only evidence the thing had happened, and evidence mattered in ways that felt abstract until the moment it didn't. Harold, as she had predicted, did not come back. What he did instead was attempt, from Baltimore, to file the civil damages claim that Price had warned her about. Price handled it with the efficient dispassion of a man disposing of something not worth extended effort. The claim was dismissed in February on the grounds that the alleged domestic contract had no legal standing and that the documented record of Ms. Mercer's unpaid skilled labor on behalf of the plaintiff constituted, if anything, a claim running in the opposite direction. Price's letter informing her of the dismissal was 4 sentences long. The last sentence read, "I would not anticipate further contact from this party." She read it standing at the office desk on a Wednesday afternoon with the snow coming down outside the window, and she folded it and put it in the cabinet and stood there for a moment with her hand on the drawer. And what she felt was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more durable, the feeling of a door closing properly, the latch catching, the weight settling into place. She went back to the feed inventory she'd been working on and finished it before supper. The wedding happened in March. It was not a grand event. Eliza had not wanted grand, and Gideon was constitutionally unsuited to grand, and the result was a ceremony conducted by a justice of the peace in the Millhaven courthouse on a Thursday morning with Clara Marsh and Bill Halloran as witnesses, and Cody in the back row wearing his best shirt and a grin he'd been unable to suppress since he heard the date. Roy was there. He had not said anything about it to Eliza directly, but he had, without explanation, repaired the hinge on the front gate of the ranch house 2 days before and painted it, which was the kind of thing Roy did instead of saying things. Mabel was there in a dress that suggested she owned better clothes than she generally wore and had simply been waiting for a reason to surface them. Hector wept, briefly, and was extremely dignified about it. The justice of the peace read the relevant words. Gideon said what he was supposed to say in a voice that was low and deliberate and meant every syllable. Eliza said what she was supposed to say and found, to her own mild surprise, that her voice was steady. He put a ring on her hand that she recognized. She'd seen it in his top bureau drawer once, not snooping, just noticing, and had assumed it was his mother's. She had been right about that. It was a small, plain band, worn smooth on the inside curve. She looked at it on her hand after, outside the courthouse in the thin March sunshine, while Cody was shaking Gideon's hand with excessive enthusiasm and Clara was having a low, warm conversation with Mabel. "It was your mother's," she said. "Yes." "You don't have to—" "I wanted to," he said, which was, coming from Gideon, the equivalent of a lengthy speech. She looked at the ring for another moment. Then she looked up at him, at the face she had been reading for 6 months and was still learning. The scar along his jaw, the way the skin around his eyes had been marked by years of squinting into western light, the particular stillness that she now understood was not coldness, but a form of discipline, the decision a man makes when he has learned that carelessness with himself costs other people. "I'm going to be difficult," she said, "to be married to. I'm going to have opinions about everything, and I'm going to want to know the reasoning behind decisions, and I'm going to keep the books the way I keep them, regardless of what anyone thinks." "I know," he said, "and I'm going to need—" She stopped, started again. "I'm still learning how to trust things that last. It's going to take longer than it should. I know that too. You're not bothered by it. I'm a patient man. She almost smiled. You told me in your letter you weren't looking for sweetness. I wasn't. Good. She looked at the ring again. Because I'm not sure I know how. You made Hector cry at a courthouse wedding, he said. I think you're closer than you think. That startled a real laugh out of her, which was still something he produced only occasionally and seemed to regard with the particular satisfaction of a man who has done something genuinely difficult well. They went to dinner at the only decent restaurant in Millhaven, all 7 of them around a table that was too small, and it was loud and slightly chaotic, and Roy spilled his coffee, and Cody told a story that may or may not have been true about a horse and a telegraph wire, and Clara and Mabel discovered they had opinions in common about the management of livestock in winter that they had apparently been saving for just such an occasion, and Gideon sat at the end of the table and was quiet in his way, and Eliza sat beside him and was not quiet in hers, and it was imperfect and warm and entirely real. Spring came to the Wyoming territory with the particular ferocity of a season that has been held back too long, and Blackwood Ranch came with it. The 23 head of cattle recovered from the Crow settlement were integrated into the herd, and the herd was, for the first time in 2 years, moving in the right direction. Numbers up, condition good, the winter losses lower than Hector had projected because Eliza had caught a feed calculation error in October that would have left the North pasture animals short by the 3rd month of cold. She didn't make a particular event of catching it, she just corrected it and told Hector and went back to what she was doing. Hector told everyone anyway, because Hector was a man who believed credit should go where it belonged, and had apparently decided that this was a principle worth maintaining even when the recipient was embarrassed by it. The water rights stood. Price had worked through the late winter months to get the documentation filed in the Territorial Land Office, as well as the county office, redundant records in 2 systems that would now have to be challenged in both places simultaneously if anyone wanted to revisit the matter. Nobody did. Crow's investigation was ongoing, and his attention was, by all accounts, fully occupied by his own problems. 2 of the neighboring ranchers who had stayed neutral through the previous year came to Gideon in April with requests for the same kind of documentation assistance Eliza had provided to the Hallorans and the Suttons. She spent a Saturday with each of them, going through their original filings and helping them build the same organized, redundant records she'd built for Blackwood. She did it because it was the right thing to do, and because she understood now, in a way she hadn't fully understood before, that the safety of any one piece of the valley was connected to the safety of all the others. Harold had operated by keeping people isolated. Crow had operated the same way, picking off ranchers one at a time because no one was watching what happened to the next person. You could fight that with a gun, which was temporary. You could fight it with paper, which lasted longer. She preferred paper. In May, a young woman arrived in Millhaven on the afternoon train. Her name was Lucy Vance, she was 23, and she had been sent by a placement agency in Denver to work as a cook's helper at a ranch 20 miles east of town. She was sitting on a bench at the depot when Eliza came to collect the mail, and she had 2 bags and the particular expression of a person trying to look less frightened than they are. Eliza sat down beside her without announcing herself and said, "Are you waiting for someone?" "A man named Potter. He's supposed to collect me." Lucy glanced around the depot. "The train was early, I think." "It was. He'll probably be another half hour." Eliza settled in. "Is this your first time west?" "First time anywhere, really." Lucy's hands were in her lap in a way that looked familiar. "I came from Indiana. My family—" She stopped. It was time to go. Eliza did not ask the follow-up questions. She recognized the shape of what wasn't being said. She talked to the girl for 40 minutes about practical things. What to expect from the climate, what the work would likely involve, what the nearest town with a doctor was, how the mail service worked. She wrote down Price's address in Cheyenne on a scrap of paper and said, "This is a lawyer, a good one. If you ever need someone who will listen to you without requiring you to be someone's problem first, write to him." Lucy took the paper. She looked at it. Then she looked at Eliza with the careful, measuring look of someone trying to figure out why a stranger is being kind and whether it costs anything. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me." Eliza stood when she saw Potter's wagon turning into the depot road. "Just keep your own records. Dates, amounts, anything that matters. Write it down." She went to collect the mail. She didn't look back because she understood that what the girl needed was not someone hovering, but someone having treated her like she already had what she needed to manage, which she did, even if she didn't know it yet. On the ride home, she thought about that for a while, about how many women had sat on benches like that one, in depots and boarding houses and kitchens, waiting for whatever came next and hoping it would be better than whatever came before. About how often the difference between surviving something and being destroyed by it was not character or strength or virtue, but simply whether one other person had treated you like you were worth the trouble of being honest with. She thought about a letter that had said, "Come if you want a fair life. Don't come if you expect an easy one." She had wanted a fair life. She had not expected an easy one. And the fair life had turned out to be something she had to build herself, from the inside out, which was not what she'd understood when she got on the train in Baltimore with 43 cents and 4 healing bruises, and the deliberate, necessary faith that somewhere west of everything she knew, something different was possible. It had been possible. It had also been considerably more complicated than that. Both things were true, and she was done pretending one of them wasn't. Gideon found her in the garden in late July. It was not much of a garden yet. She'd started it in May, which was too late for some things, and the right time for others. And the result was a productive mess of tomato plants and runner beans and a row of something that Mabel had planted without telling anyone what it was, which had turned out to be squash of an extremely ambitious variety. Gideon came around the corner of the house and stopped at the edge of it with his hands in his pockets, and looked at it with the expression of a man genuinely uncertain what to make of something. "It's bigger than last month," he said. "Things grow." She was on her knees pulling something that didn't belong. "Mabel's squash is trying to annex the tomatoes." "Can you stop it?" "Probably not. I'm negotiating a border." She sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, which was doing what gardens do, growing in the directions it wanted to, regardless of the directions intended for it. Producing things in quantities and combinations nobody had exactly planned, demanding constant attention and giving back in ways that were real but not always predictable. She had found, not bad at it. Gideon crouched down beside her, not to help, just to be at the same level. He picked up a bit of soil and turned it in his fingers and let it fall. "Hector wants to hire 2 more hands for the fall drive," he said. "I think he's right." "He is. The numbers support it. I ran the projections last week. The drive revenue will more than cover the additional wages if we increase the headcount by the end of August." "I figured you'd already looked at it." "I figured you knew I'd already looked at it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She had been collecting those sounds for months, the way some people collected objects, noting them, placing them, understanding their relative rarity, and therefore their value. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. Not the careful, prefacing tone of a man about to deliver bad news. Just the plain register he used for things that mattered. "All right. There are 2 families in the valley who lost their places last year, before we were organized, before we had the documentation together." He looked at the garden. "The Prewitt family, husband, wife, 3 kids, and an older man named Sayers who ranched alone for 20 years until Crow's water interference put him under." He paused. "They're in Mill Haven. The Prewitts are in the 2-room over the livery, and Sayers is sleeping in the back of the hardware store." She looked at him. "I want to bring them here," he said. "The Prewitts could work the South operation. Pete moved on last month, and that section needs a family that knows cattle. Sayers knows fencing and irrigation better than anyone in the valley." He turned a stone over in his fingers. "We've got the room. The bunkhouse has the space, and the Prewitt family could use the small cabin on the east side that's been empty since the Garrity hand moved out." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since December. I wanted to make sure we were stable enough to carry it before I said anything." She understood that. The caution of a man who has learned not to make promises he can't keep. She had learned over these months to see this quality in him not as coldness or withholding, but as a form of care. The same form her mother might have shown if she'd lived long enough to figure out how to be better at it. Some people showed love by being warm in the moment. Gideon showed it by making sure the moment was real before he named it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, bring them," she said. "Both families." She went back to the runner beans. "I'll need to update the payroll projections." "I know. And the cabin needs a new stove. I looked at it last month. The current one is going to fail by October." "I know that too." "You know a lot of things you haven't mentioned." I was waiting to see what you thought. She stopped pulling weeds and looked at him properly. At the face she had been married to for 4 months and had known for 7, and was still, she suspected, only in the early portions of understanding. He was not an easy man to know. He had corners she hadn't reached yet, and rooms in himself he hadn't opened, and she had stopped expecting otherwise, because expecting a person to be entirely knowable was a way of making them smaller than they were, and she refused to do that to him. I think it's the right thing, she said, and I think you already knew that. I wanted you to think so too. Because it's our ranch, she said. Not a question, not pointed, just the plain fact of it, stated in the same way he stated plain facts. He looked at her steadily. Because it's our ranch, he said. She nodded. Then she went back to work, and he sat at the edge of the garden in the July sun for another few minutes before he stood and went back to whatever he'd been doing before, and neither of them felt the need to make more of it than it was. The Prewitt family arrived on a Friday. Tom Prewitt was 38, solid and quiet, with the efficient movements of a man who had done hard outdoor work his whole life. His wife Nora was sharp-eyed and practical, and looked at the cabin on the east side with the expression of a woman making rapid calculations about what could be done with it. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, the youngest maybe 5, stood in the yard and looked at the horses in the paddock with the specific paralyzed wonder of children encountering something that has not yet become ordinary. Eliza showed Nora the cabin and did not apologize for the stove because Nora did not seem like a woman who needed anything softened. She showed her where the water access was and where the kitchen garden was, and told her plainly what the work arrangement would be. Equal wages, she said, same as any skilled hand. If Tom is doing the work of a skilled hand, which I believe he is, he gets paid accordingly. Nora looked at her carefully. The last 2 places we worked, the arrangements were— I know what those arrangements are like, Eliza said. That's not how this works. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the children can't be in the way of the regular work. I'll make sure— The children are fine, Eliza said. Cody will probably teach them to do things they shouldn't be doing within the first week, and Roy will complain about it and then teach them to do different things. That's just how it goes. Nora laughed. A surprised, short laugh, the kind that escapes before the person decides whether to allow it. Old Sayers arrived the same afternoon. I was 61 years old and walked with the slight forward lean of a man who has spent decades working closer to the ground than to standing height. He had very little with him and accepted the bunkhouse space with the dignity of a man who was done being grateful for basic decency and had decided simply to receive it as his due, which Eliza thought was exactly the right response. He looked at the south irrigation line that afternoon and spent 45 minutes poking around it, and came back to tell Hector that the east intake valve was positioned wrong and had been losing them water volume for probably 2 years. Hector said he'd known something was off about that section. Sayers said he'd fix it Thursday if someone could get him the right fittings from Mill Haven. Cody went to Mill Haven for the fittings on Wednesday. The intake valve was fixed by Friday afternoon, and the water pressure in the south line improved measurably within a week, which Hector announced at supper with the slightly vindicated tone of a man who had suspected a problem for 2 years and was glad to have it confirmed and solved simultaneously. The letter from Price came in September. It was longer than usual, which meant it contained something worth saying at length. She read it in the office in the hour after dinner, with the lamp lit and the early September dark pressing against the window. The investigation into the county clerk's office had concluded. The clerk had cooperated fully, and the evidence from the Crow correspondence had been sufficient to support 3 separate charges. Silas Crow had, 2 weeks prior, settled those charges through a negotiated agreement that included the payment of substantial fines and the mandatory sale of 2 of his 3 combined operations. The Crown Sea itself was not included in the forced sale, but its size was now effectively halved, and the attorneys involved expected no further territorial expansion from that quarter. Price's final paragraph said, "It is perhaps worth noting that the documentation compiled by your household, the chemical analysis, the filed theft reports, the water rights records, the timeline of events, formed a significant portion of the evidentiary foundation for this investigation. Evidence does not speak for itself. Someone must take the trouble to make it speak. You did that work." She folded the letter, sat there for a moment. She thought about the first Thursday she'd spent in the office, looking at ledgers that were a mess, and the particular clear-headed satisfaction of making things legible. She thought about the morning she'd identified the Henderson billing error and Gideon's face when she told him. She thought about the night she'd worked until midnight, writing 6 pages of documented timeline by lamplight, her hand moving steadily across the page while the ranch slept around her. And she had not known then whether it would matter, only that it needed to exist. It had mattered. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she had felt in Price's office when they filed the sworn statement. The quiet, lasting satisfaction of a thing done right. The sense of a foundation that would hold weight because it had been built carefully and not in haste. She put the letter in the cabinet. She locked it. She went to find Gideon. He was on the porch in the dark, which was where he went sometimes in the evenings. Not brooding, just being outside, the way some people needed walls around them and some people needed the sky. She sat down beside him on the porch steps and told him what the letter said. He listened. When she finished, he looked out at the yard for a moment. Then he said, "It's over." "The crow part of it," she said. "Yes. And Finch. And Harold. And the water rights. Those are solid now. Price says they'll hold indefinitely." He nodded slowly. The September night was cool and enormous and full of the sounds of the ranch in its evening state. Horses in the paddock, a door closing somewhere in the bunkhouse, the Prewitt children's voices briefly audible and then gone, domestic and ordinary and entirely real. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. Not a question, just the beginning of a thought he'd decided to say out loud. "What?" "The letter I wrote. To the agency." He shifted slightly. "I wrote 2 sentences about what I wanted and 3 about what I couldn't offer. I thought I was being honest." "You were." "I was being honest about the parts I could see." He looked at the dark yard. "I didn't know what I was actually asking for." She looked at him. "What were you actually asking for?" He was quiet for a moment. Someone who would look at a problem and not flinch away from it. Someone who would still be there when things got difficult. He paused. Someone who would sit at the edge of a garden and negotiate with squash and mean it. She laughed. It came out genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh she'd been learning to let happen. "That's a very specific requirement," she said. "I'm a specific man." She looked at the yard, at the dark cottonwoods along the creek, at the stars doing what Wyoming stars did. She thought about the train from Baltimore and the depot platform and the sound of his boots on the wagon boards, and 4 words said quietly, as a statement of fact. "Those are the last bruises you'll ever wear." He had not been able to guarantee that, and he'd acknowledged it immediately when she challenged him. And then he had spent the subsequent months making it as true as a person could make a thing that depended partly on circumstances outside their control. That was not a perfect outcome. It was a human one. She had come to understand the difference and to prefer the human one, because the human one was real and you could build on real. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." "I came here because I needed out. That was true, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at her hands in the dark. "But I stayed because of something different. I stayed because you told me the truth, even when it wasn't flattering, and you gave me a key and meant it, and you sat across a desk from me and worked through problems like they were things that had solutions instead of things that needed to be endured." She paused. "I didn't know that was possible. With another person. I thought it was something you could only do alone." He was listening. He did that. Really listened, without preparing his response while you were still talking, without needing to show you that he was listening, just actually doing it. "I was wrong," she said, "about that one thing." "Only the one?" he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Don't push it." He almost laughed. She'd been accumulating those too. They sat on the porch steps in the September dark, and the ranch settled around them into its nighttime self, and after a while Gideon said, "The south irrigation repairs increased the water volume by about 12%. Sayers thinks we could extend the lower pasture by spring. I saw the measurements. We'd need to file an amendment with the county. Price can handle that. I'll write to him." "I know you will." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the dark with the steady, patient attention he gave to things he cared about. She had stopped waiting for him to become someone who expressed things more easily, because she had come to understand that expression was not the measure of the thing expressed. What a person did, consistently, over time, under pressure, that was the text. Everything else was just preamble. He had driven 2 days to Cheyenne so she could file a sworn statement. He had given her a key and a room and a wage and a voice in decisions. He had stood on a porch in the dark with his hands at his sides and told Harold Finch that she was not a thing to be collected. He had sat at the edge of a ruined water well and looked at boot prints in the ground and made a decision not to let anger run ahead of thinking, because the thinking was what would actually help. None of this was smooth. None of it was simple. He was difficult in the particular ways that careful private people are difficult, and she was difficult in the particular ways that people who have been ground down and rebuilt themselves are difficult, and they managed it imperfectly on an ongoing basis the way most things worth managing are managed. She would not have exchanged it. Their daughter was born the following April, in the upstairs room with the window that looked south toward the cottonwoods and the creek. Mabel delivered her with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had done this before and regarded the process as extraordinary only in the ways that mattered. Gideon was downstairs for most of it, in the particular anguished patience of a man who has been told to stay out of the way and is finding this instruction very difficult to follow. Cody kept him company, which mostly meant Cody talked and Gideon stood at the bottom of the stairs and tried not to look like he was counting minutes. When Mabel called down that everything was fine and he could come up, he took the stairs in a way that was not running but was very close to it. The baby was small and red and emphatically unhappy about the temperature of the world, which Eliza found entirely reasonable. She was lying in the bed she'd slept in since September of the previous year with the real mattress and the key in the lock. And the baby was in her arms, and Gideon was sitting on the edge of the bed looking at both of them with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the careful blankness, not the compressed warmth, but something open and undefended that he had either forgotten to manage or decided not to. "She's angry," he said, about the crying. "She's cold and she's been inconvenienced," Eliza said. "She'll get used to it." He reached out and put one careful finger against the baby's hand. The baby, with the immediate reflexive grip of the newborn, grabbed it. He went very still. "What's her name?" he said. They had talked about names and not resolved it, the way certain conversations resolve themselves better in the actual moment than in the theoretical one. Eliza looked at the baby, then at Gideon. "Margaret," she said, "after your mother." She had not told him she was going to say that. She'd decided somewhere between contractions, which was not the most rational decision-making environment, but had produced the right answer. He looked at the baby holding his finger. He looked at Eliza. His face did something she would not describe to him because he would be embarrassed by the description, but which she would remember precisely for a long time. "All right," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "Margaret Alice Blackwood," she said. "She can go by Maggie if she wants. That'll be her choice." "Everything's going to be her choice," he said. "Far as I'm concerned." Eliza looked at the baby, Maggie, Margaret, the latest resident of Blackwood Ranch, and thought about what it meant to bring someone into a place and mean the word home when you said it. To mean that here the records were in order, and the water rights were filed in 2 offices, and the doors had locks that worked, and the people around you had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that this was worth showing up for. Not perfect. Not finished. The Crow investigation was still grinding along through its legal stages. The county clerk would probably be dealing with the consequences for another year. There were fence lines that needed attention, and a winter's worth of feed calculations to project, and 2 families on the ranch whose situations she was still learning how to support well. There was always more. The frontier was not a problem you solved. It was a condition you inhabited, and the inhabiting was ongoing and required everything you had on any given day and sometimes more. But here, in this room, in this particular April morning, Mabel was downstairs making something that smelled like coffee and something sweet. And outside the window, the cottonwoods were just beginning to show their spring green against the Wyoming sky. And Gideon's daughter had his finger in a death grip and was beginning, tentatively, to stop crying, and Eliza was exactly where she had decided to be. She had chosen this. Not out of desperation, not because there was nothing else. She had looked at what was real, and she had chosen it, plainly and deliberately, and with full knowledge of the cost. And the cost had been worth it in the specific way that things are worth it when you've paid with something genuine. That was the thing nobody told you about starting over. It was not a clean break. The past came with you. Harold's voice was still in her head sometimes when she made a mistake, Still the voice that said, "You're not capable of this. You're not equipped for this." And she had learned that the right response was not to silence it, but to answer it, quietly, with evidence. With the Henderson billing error, corrected. With the 6 pages of documentation written by lamplight. With the sworn statement filed in Cheyenne. With the intake valve fixed and the water pressure improved and the letter from Price that said someone must take the trouble to make it speak. With this. With Maggie. With Gideon on the edge of the bed with his face undefended for once, holding his daughter's hand. The bruises had healed. Not all at once. That was not how healing worked, whatever anyone wanted to believe. But over time, day by day, replaced slowly by the ordinary marks of a life actually lived. A callus on her right hand from the pen, a scar on her left palm from a barbed wire incident in November that she should have been more careful about, the small lines at the corners of her eyes from spending a year squinting into the Wyoming light. She looked like someone who worked. She looked like someone who had been in difficult situations and had not been destroyed by them. She looked, she supposed, like herself, like the person she had been before Harold Finch had spent 12 years trying to convince her that person wasn't worth very much. She had disagreed with him about that. She had been right. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the spring wind, and Blackwood Ranch went about its morning, and Margaret Alice Blackwood, 8 pounds and furious and entirely new, looked out at the world she had arrived in and decided, for now, to stop crying. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly what was promised. Not an easy life, but a fair one. And Eliza Blackwood held her daughter, and her husband held her hand, and the Wyoming sky went on in every direction, enormous and indifferent, and not particularly interested in anyone's story. That was all right. She had learned to tell it herself.